Welcome, dear listener, to another journey into the forgotten corners of history, those unglamorous details that rarely make it into the saga stories or the dramatic television series. I hope this finds you comfortable wherever you are in the world, perhaps settling in for the evening or seeking a calm escape from the demands of your day. If you're enjoying these explorations of history's less celebrated truths, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you might imagine. Tonight we're going to examine something that sounds almost quaint from our modern perspective: Viking rules and regulations. When most people think of Vikings, they picture raiders and warriors, men who lived by the sword and died by it, a culture of honour and glory and violence. But the truth, as always, is far more complicated and far more interesting. The Norse people of Scandinavia lived under elaborate legal codes, systems of rules and obligations that governed everything from hospitality to livestock management to the proper way to execute criminals. These weren't arbitrary traditions or honour-bound customs. They were survival mechanisms, carefully evolved responses to an environment that could kill you in dozens of ways. Picture, if you will, a world where winter darkness lasted for months, where a failed harvest meant certain death, where your nearest neighbour might be an hour's walk away through forests filled with wolves and bears. In such a world, rules weren't about maintaining social order, they were about preventing everyone from dying. So settle in, dear listener, as we explore the bizarre logic of Viking law and discover how seemingly strange regulations were actually the thin thread holding communities together against the constant threat of collapse. Let us begin by establishing where and when we find ourselves. The Viking Age, traditionally dated from 793 to 1066 CE, spans nearly 3 centuries of Norse expansion, trade, and settlement. But our focus tonight isn't on the raids or the exploration, it's on the home communities, the farmsteads and villages scattered across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. These were not clustered medieval towns, but isolated settlements spread across some of the most challenging terrain in Europe. Imagine the geography. Narrow valleys between mountains, fjords cutting deep into rocky coastlines, vast forests of pine and birch, and beyond the Arctic Circle, a landscape of tundra and ice. The growing season in much of Scandinavia lasted perhaps 4 months. Winter could arrive in September and last until May. Farmsteads were often separated by hours or days of travel, connected by narrow paths through dense forest or treacherous mountain passes. This wasn't a landscape that fostered easy community. It was one that isolated, that separated, that made every family essentially alone for months at a time. The climate was brutal in ways we struggle to comprehend today. This was the medieval warm period initially, which made Norse expansion possible, but it was still far colder than most inhabited regions today. Temperatures in winter could plunge to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Snow could bury buildings to their roofs. Sea ice could trap ships for months. And crucially, the weather was unpredictable. A late spring frost could destroy an entire year's crops. A harsh early winter could kill livestock not yet sheltered. A storm during harvest could mean starvation before spring. In this environment, Norse culture developed a sophisticated legal system, maintained entirely through oral tradition and community enforcement. There was no centralised government, no police force, no standing army to enforce laws. Instead, communities gathered at assemblies called things, the Althing in Iceland, the Gulating in Norway, where free men debated cases, passed judgments, and established precedents. These weren't merely legal proceedings. They were theatrical performances, social gatherings, religious ceremonies, and sometimes battlefields when tempers overruled reason. The law codes that survive, particularly the Icelandic Greigas, the Norwegian Gulathing laws and references scattered through the sagas, reveal a culture obsessed with preventing chaos. Every conceivable dispute had procedures, property boundaries, animal damage, inheritance divisions, injury compensations, insult responses, marriage arrangements, slave management, and on and on. The level of detail is remarkable. How many shields could you break in a duel before being declared defeated? 3. How long could you legally shelter a fugitive before becoming complicit in his crimes? 3 days. How much silver should you pay if your bull gores your neighbour's thrall? It depended on which bones were broken. But here's what's crucial to understand. These weren't abstract legal philosophies or honour-bound traditions passed down from some heroic age. They were practical solutions to practical problems, developed through generations of trial and error, refined through countless examples of what happened when you didn't have such rules. Every bizarre regulation we'll explore tonight exists because, at some point, the absence of that rule led to catastrophe. The thesis of our exploration is simple. Viking laws weren't designed to create a just society or to uphold some code of honour. They were designed to keep people alive. In a world where the margin between survival and death was so thin, where one bad decision could doom an entire family, where the social fabric could unravel into blood feuds that depopulated entire regions, these rules were the difference between functioning communities and complete collapse. They seem strange to us now because we live in a world of abundance and security they couldn't imagine. But in their context, every bizarre requirement made brutal, pragmatic sense. So let us now turn to these rules themselves and discover the dark logic that governed daily life in the Viking Age. Chapter 1. The Mandatory Hospitality Law. The first rule we must understand is perhaps the most fundamental: the legal obligation to provide hospitality to travellers. In the Norse world, if someone arrived at your door seeking shelter, you were legally required to take them in. Not merely encouraged, legally obligated. Refusal could result in fines, loss of property, or even outlawry, which meant you lost all legal protection and could be killed with impunity. This seems remarkably generous, almost utopian, until you understand the context that made such a law necessary. Picture a Norse farmstead in late autumn. The longhouse sits in a cleared area surrounded by forest, smoke rising from the central hearth. The sun sets earlier each day now, and the first serious snowfall is perhaps a week away. A traveller appears on the path, a merchant heading for the coast, a farmer visiting distant relatives, someone displaced by a dispute in their home community. He's exhausted, frost already forming in his beard despite the early hour. He knocks on your door seeking shelter for the night. In our modern context, this seems like a simple request. In the Viking Age, it was a legal transaction with life or death consequences. The law specified exactly what hospitality required. You must provide shelter from the elements, a place by the fire, protection from wind and snow. You must provide food, even if only simple fare like porridge and dried fish. You must allow the traveller to stay for up to 3 nights without question. After 3 nights, you could legally inquire about their purpose and request they move on, but those first 3 nights were sacrosanct. The Gregos law codes are explicit about this. Refusing travellers was a serious offence, one that demonstrated you were placing your own comfort above community survival. But here's what made this truly brutal. The hospitality law didn't exist because Vikings were particularly generous people. It existed because without it, travellers died constantly, and those deaths created legal nightmares. If a traveller froze to death on or near your property, you could be held legally responsible. The corpse on your land was evidence of your refusal to provide aid. Families of the deceased could bring cases against you, demanding compensation for failing in your legal duty. The Thing Assembly would examine the circumstances. Did you know someone was seeking shelter? Did you refuse them? Was their death preventable had you simply opened your door? This created a perverse incentive structure. It was actually safer, legally speaking, to provide hospitality than to risk someone dying nearby. The frozen corpse 20 yards from your door could cost you everything: your property, your legal standing, your place in the community. Better to feed and house a stranger for 3 nights than face accusations at the next assembly. The law didn't make people generous, It made refusal more dangerous than acceptance. Hospitality wasn't kindness, it was liability management. The sagas preserved numerous examples of this dynamic in action. In Grettir's saga, the outlaw Grettir seeks shelter at various farms during his long years of banishment. Some farmers provide hospitality willingly, others reluctantly, but all understand the legal obligation. When one farmer refuses Grettir shelter, despite recognising him as an outlaw, the saga treats this refusal as a serious matter worthy of extended discussion. The farmer hasn't just been unkind, he's violated fundamental law, even though Grettir himself was outside legal protection. The tension between hospitality obligation and fear of harbouring a dangerous outlaw forms a recurring theme, demonstrating how deeply ingrained this law was in Norse consciousness. So the next time you read about Viking hospitality in some romantic saga story, remember the reality. It wasn't generosity but fear that kept doors open to strangers. Fear of legal consequences, fear of being held responsible for deaths, fear of the Thing Assembly's judgment. In a world where winter could kill someone in hours, mandatory hospitality wasn't about being welcoming. It was about preventing your property from becoming a graveyard. Chapter 2. The Ale Requirement. Let us now turn to a rule that seems almost absurd from our modern perspective. The legal requirement for farms to produce ale. This wasn't a suggestion or a cultural preference. In many regions, farms above a certain size were legally obligated to maintain brewing equipment and produce minimum quantities of ale for community gatherings, particularly the Thing Assemblies. Failure to meet this obligation could result in fines. At first glance, this seems like the Vikings prioritising drinking over more practical concerns, but as with all these rules, the reality was far darker and more pragmatic. Imagine a Norse farm in spring, the snow finally melting after 6 months of winter. The longhouse is filled with the yeasty smell of fermentation. Large ceramic vessels sit near the fire, their contents bubbling as wild yeasts work their slow magic on barley and water. The farm wife tends these vessels carefully, checking temperatures, tasting samples, adding herbs for flavour and preservation. This isn't recreational brewing, this is survival infrastructure. What looks like alcohol production was actually water purification, and the ale requirement was about keeping people alive. The simple, horrifying truth was that clean water was scarce in Norse settlements. Springs and streams could be contaminated by animal waste, human refuse, decomposing carcasses, or any number of other hazards. Without modern sanitation or water treatment, drinking water directly was genuinely dangerous. Dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases could race through a community, killing dozens. The Norse understood this empirically, if not scientifically. They knew that water made people sick, but they didn't know why. Allah solved this problem through fermentation. The brewing process, particularly the boiling stage, killed most harmful bacteria and parasites. The alcohol content, even at relatively low levels, further inhibited bacterial growth. The result was a beverage that was far safer to drink than water. Norse ale wasn't particularly strong by modern standards, perhaps 3 to 5% alcohol, but it was clean. More importantly, everyone drank it. Men, women, children, thralls. Everyone consumed ale daily because it was the only safe liquid widely available. This is where the law becomes comprehensible. The ale requirement wasn't about having drinks available for parties. It was about ensuring every farm maintained the equipment and knowledge to produce safe drinking liquid. Thing assemblies, which could gather hundreds of people for days or weeks, required enormous quantities of ale because you couldn't serve those crowds untreated water without triggering epidemic disease. The farms hosting or supplying assemblies needed to produce sufficient ale, or people would die. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation beautifully. Every excavated longhouse of any size contains brewing equipment, ceramic vessels, wooden vats, specialised tools for straining and storage. The sheer ubiquity of this equipment demonstrates that brewing wasn't optional or specialised. It was as fundamental as cooking. chemical analysis of residues in these vessels confirms they were used repeatedly, constantly, season after season. This was infrastructure for survival. But here's the darkest part. Children drank weak ale from infancy. Not because Vikings were careless about childhood alcohol consumption, but because the alternative was watching children die from dysentery before their 5th birthday. Infant and child mortality was already catastrophically high. Perhaps 40% died before age 5. Waterborne diseases made those odds even worse. Giving children diluted ale wasn't irresponsibility. It was desperate pragmatism. Better a child who grew up consuming small amounts of alcohol than a dead child who drank contaminated water. The Icelandic sagas make numerous references to ale consumption at gatherings, often treating it as completely mundane. Characters don't remark on ale being served any more than they'd remark on breathing air. This wasn't because they were drunkards, but because ale was simply the default beverage for all occasions. When saga characters do remark on drinking water, it's usually in context of hardship or penance. Drinking water was what you did when you had no better option, or when you were demonstrating austerity. It's hard not to feel a certain queasy recognition here. We live in a world where clean water flows from taps without thought, where we give our children water bottles for school, where hydration is simple and safe. The Norse lived in a world so contaminated that alcohol was safer than water, and law had to mandate its production to prevent epidemic disease. The ale requirement wasn't about Viking drinking culture. It was about public health infrastructure in a world without sanitation, and the law existed because without it, assemblies became plague grounds, and communities collapsed from preventable disease. Chapter 3. The Weapon Peace Law. Our next rule takes us into the realm of violence prevention. The Weapon Peace Law, which mandated disarmament at thing assemblies and certain religious sites. When free men gathered for legal proceedings or religious ceremonies, they were required to leave their weapons at designated areas, under guard or simply stacked at the assembly's edge. Violating weapon peace, bringing weapons into the assembly ground after being warned, was a serious offence that could result in fines, outlawry, or immediate violence from other assembly members. This seems like simple common sense until you understand the context that made such a law desperately necessary. Picture the Althing in Iceland, the great assembly held each summer at Thingvellir. Hundreds of people gather in the dramatic Rift Valley, setting up temporary camps that sprawl across the landscape. Men arrive from every corner of Iceland, many travelling for weeks to attend. These aren't neutral gatherings of strangers, they're meetings of people with long histories, grudges spanning generations, unresolved disputes that have festered for years. That farmer whose brother you killed in a property dispute 3 years ago is here. That chieftain whose daughter rejected your son's marriage proposal is here. That man who claims you stole his best ram is here. Now imagine all these people armed with swords, axes and spears, gathering to discuss contentious legal cases in an environment with no police force to separate them if tempers flare. The Weapon Peace Law attempted to prevent these assemblies from becoming massacre sites. The designated assembly ground was sacred space where violence was forbidden by both legal and religious sanction. Odin himself, in his role as god of law and justice, was invoked as witness to the proceedings. Breaking weapon peace was thus both a legal violation and a sacrilegious act, offending both human community and divine order. Guards stood at the assembly boundaries checking for weapons, and men who arrived armed were required to leave their weapons stacked under guard before entering. In theory, this created a neutral space where disputes could be resolved through words and legal argument rather than violence. Men could stand face to face with their enemies, presenting their cases before witnesses, relying on law rather than the strength of their sword arm. The system worked remarkably well much of the time. Thousands of cases were adjudicated peacefully, judgments rendered, compensations paid, and order maintained without bloodshed. But here's what made this truly brutal. The Weapon Peace Law existed. precisely because without it assemblies descended into slaughter so frequently that the entire legal system was at risk of collapse. The sagas preserve numerous accounts of assembly violence, even with weapon peace in effect. Men would smuggle daggers in their clothing, hide weapons near the assembly ground, or simply lose control and attack their enemies with rocks, fists, or opportunistic weapons. The saga of Burnton Jarl describes multiple instances of assembly violence, including the burning of the law speaker's booth and armed confrontations that left dozens dead. The mathematics of violence were terrifying. One man with a sword could kill or wound 3 or 4 men before being brought down. A planned ambush by a determined group could wipe out a rival family line in minutes. Blood feuds operated on principles of equivalent retaliation. If you killed one of their men, they were honour bound to kill one of yours. Assembly gatherings, which brought feuding families into close proximity, were perfect opportunities for settling scores. Without weapon peace, every assembly risked becoming a multi-sided battle that could depopulate entire regions. The law recognised a grim calculus. Weapon peace wouldn't prevent all violence, but it would reduce assembly deaths from dozens to perhaps 1 or 2. Those 1 or 2 deaths were still tragedies, still triggered blood feuds and required compensation, but they didn't collapse the social order entirely. The assembly could survive 2 men killed in a brawl. It couldn't survive 40 men killed in a sword fight. Weapon peace was about harm reduction, not elimination, accepting that some violence was inevitable, but trying to prevent complete catastrophe. Even with these laws, assembly violence remained common enough that the entire legal system developed procedures for handling it. If someone was killed at the assembly, immediate judgment could be rendered, compensation set, and the killer granted safe passage home to gather payment. The assumption was that violence would happen despite best efforts to prevent it, so the system needed mechanisms to contain the damage quickly before it spiraled into wider conflict. So the next time you read about Viking legal assemblies in some saga story, remember that the weapon peace law wasn't about creating a civilized space for rational discourse. It was a desperate measure to prevent legal gatherings from becoming killing fields, recognizing that human nature and blood feud culture made violence almost inevitable, and the best the law could do was reduce massacre to murder. Chapter 4. The Outlawry Escape Clause. Let us now examine one of the most feared punishments in Norse law, outlawry. But within this harsh sentence existed a peculiar distinction, the difference between lesser outlawry and full outlawry. This wasn't merely a matter of degree but of survival. Lesser outlawry meant banishment for 3 years, full outlawry meant permanent exile with no hope of return. Both removed you from legal protection, making it legal for anyone to kill you without consequence, but the practical reality of these sentences reveals a dark truth about punishment in Viking society. Imagine standing before the Thing assembly as judgment is pronounced. You've been convicted of a crime, perhaps theft, perhaps assault, perhaps something more serious. The law speaker's voice carries across the assembly ground as he declares you skognger, forest goer, stripped of legal protection. If it's lesser outlawry, you have 3 years to survive outside the law before you can return and reclaim your property. If it's full outlawry, you will never return, your property is forfeit, and your name becomes synonymous with shame. In either case, you must leave the community immediately, taking only what you can carry, with no family or friend legally permitted to shelter you without becoming complicit in your crime. Lesser outlawry sounds merciful by comparison. Only 3 years, possibility of return, eventual restoration. But the reality was that most men sentenced to lesser outlawry died within the first year, many within the first winter. You couldn't stay at farms without putting your hosts at legal risk. You couldn't trade in settlements. You couldn't attend assemblies or religious gatherings. You were forced into the deep wilderness, the forests and mountains, with only your own skills keeping you alive. In summer, this was merely difficult. You could hunt, fish, forage, and survive in relative isolation. In winter, it became nearly impossible. The Norse winter was a killer of unprepared people. Temperatures plunged, snow buried the landscape, game became scarce, and shelter was the difference between life and death. A man alone in the wilderness, unable to approach settlements for supplies or warmth, faced starvation, freezing, or predation. Wolves hunted in the winter, driven by their own hunger. Bears, though hibernating, could be disturbed and were deadly when surprised. But the greatest killer was simply exposure. The slow hypothermia that crept in during sleep, the frostbite that claimed fingers and toes, the infections that developed from minor injuries with no medical treatment available. Full outlawry was effectively a death sentence with extra suffering. You were driven from your homeland entirely, forced to seek refuge in foreign lands where you had no kinship ties, no legal standing, no support structure. Most full outlaws attempted to reach Iceland or other new settlements where their reputations might not precede them. But the journey itself was deadly. Months of travel through hostile territory, across dangerous seas, with the ever-present risk of recognition and murder. Many full outlaws were killed within weeks of their banishment, murdered by enemies who no longer feared legal consequences for the killing. The sagas treat outlawry as a fate worse than clean death. Greta's saga, which chronicles the longest outlawry survival in Icelandic memory, 19 years, makes clear this was an extraordinary anomaly. Greta was a man of exceptional physical strength, wilderness skills, and desperate cunning. He survived by stealing from farms under cover of night, by living in caves and hidden valleys, by occasional desperate violence when cornered. The saga treats his survival not as normal, but as barely believable, a testament to superhuman resilience. And even Greta, with all his advantages, eventually died violently at the hands of his enemies. What made this system truly brutal was its honesty about execution. Full outlawry wasn't disguised as mercy. Everyone understood it was a slow death sentence. Lesser outlawry acknowledged that 3-year survival was unlikely but possible, creating a thin hope that nonetheless condemned most men to frozen death in winter forests. The law didn't pretend these were reasonable punishments. It simply used exile as a way to remove problematic individuals without the blood guilt of direct execution. Archaeological evidence supports the saga accounts. Isolated burials far from settlements, often showing signs of violent death or winter demise, likely represent outlaws who died alone. The bones tell stories of hard lives ended early, healed fractures suggesting earlier injuries, signs of chronic malnutrition, trauma consistent with animal attacks or violence. These weren't honourable deaths in battle or peaceful passing surrounded by family. These were desperate ends in frozen wilderness, alone and abandoned. It's hard not to feel the weight of this system. In our modern context, exile might mean moving to another city, another country, starting fresh somewhere new. For the Norse, exile meant being driven into a wilderness that killed most people within months, stripped of everything that made life worth living. Family, community, legal protection, basic security. The outlawry escape clause wasn't really an escape at all. It was just a choice between death now and death slightly later. Chapter 5. The Compulsory Bathing Law. Our final rule in this first group might sound surprisingly modern, the compulsory bathing law, which required regular cleansing at communal bathhouses. Specifically, Saturday bathing was a widespread custom enforced through social pressure, and in some communities actual legal sanction. Failure to maintain basic hygiene standards could result in social exclusion, loss of trading privileges, or even fines in extreme cases. This seems remarkably progressive until you understand the medical realities that made such a law desperately necessary. Picture a Norse longhouse in deep winter. The structure is packed with people, extended family, thralls, possibly guests sheltering from weather. Everyone sleeps on platforms along the walls, bodies pressed together for warmth. The fire burns constantly but provides inadequate heat. Ice still forms on the interior walls despite the flames. People wear the same clothes for weeks or months because changing means exposure to deadly cold. They sleep in their garments for the same reason. Under these conditions, every person becomes a host for parasites, lice, fleas, mites, that feed on human blood and breed in the warm folds of clothing. The bathhouse, when available, was usually a separate structure built near water sources. It functioned similarly to a sauna. Heated stones creating steam, water poured to increase humidity, switches made of birch branches used to stimulate circulation and dislodge parasites. The heat was intense, almost unbearable, but that was precisely the point. Lice and other parasites couldn't survive the extreme temperatures. Emerging from the bathhouse meant brief exposure to winter cold while rushing back to the longhouse. But the parasites were temporarily reduced. Clothing could be beaten and aired. Skin could be actually clean for the first time in days or weeks. Saturday was chosen for religious reasons, the day before the Christian Sabbath in later Viking Age. But the practice predated Christianity and served purely practical purposes. Weekly bathing was the minimum frequency needed to control parasite populations enough to prevent the diseases they carried. Lice transmitted typhus, fleas transmitted plague, mites caused infections when their bites were scratched and introduced bacteria into broken skin. In a population living in close quarters, unable to properly clean themselves or their clothing for months at a time, parasitic infections could and did kill entire communities. But here's what made this truly brutal. Without weekly bathing, parasitic infections became gangrenous. A simple louse bite, scratched open, could introduce bacteria into the wound. In the cold, dark, unsanitary conditions of a Norse winter longhouse, that infection could spread rapidly. Gangrene developed, tissue death spreading from the initial wound, turning flesh black and necrotic. Without modern antibiotics or surgical intervention, gangrene was usually fatal. Even if it didn't kill directly, the infection could spread to blood, causing sepsis and organ failure. Entire families died from infected parasite bites in crowded winter quarters. Archaeological evidence paints a grim picture. Excavated bathhouse remains show burn marks from continuous intense use. These weren't luxury facilities used occasionally. They were critical infrastructure maintained at considerable effort and expense. Wood for heating, water for steam, labour for maintenance, all represented significant resource investment. Communities maintained bathhouses because the alternative was epidemic disease. The skeletal remains tell their own story. Bones showing signs of systemic infection, healed but debilitating lesions consistent with serious skin disease, shortened lifespans correlating with poor hygiene conditions, all point to a population fighting constant battle against parasitic illness. The individuals who received regular bathing access, typically free persons of higher status, show better health outcomes in skeletal analysis than thralls or poor free persons who lacked such access. Hygiene wasn't merely comfort, it was literal survival. The compulsory bathing law existed because social pressure alone wasn't sufficient. Some people, through poverty, disability, or simple stubbornness, avoided bathing even when facilities were available. Those individuals became disease vectors that endangered entire communities. An unbathed person bringing lice-borne typhus to a winter gathering could infect dozens of others. The law made hygiene a community obligation, enforced through legal sanction, because individual choice couldn't be permitted when it threatened collective survival. The sagas make occasional reference to bathing, usually treating it as completely unremarkable. People mention going to bathhouses the way we might mention brushing our teeth. This mundane quality is precisely the point. Bathing wasn't luxury or unusual. It was routine maintenance, like feeding animals or mending tools. The fact that law had to mandate it reveals how desperate conditions could become, how easily people living at survival's edge might skip this critical task when exhausted, ill, or simply overwhelmed by winter's grinding hardship. So the next time you read romantic descriptions of Viking feasts or winter gatherings, remember the reality. Rooms packed with bodies, clothing unchanged for months, parasites breeding in every warm fold of fabric, and skin infections that turned gangrenous without weekly bathing. The compulsory bathing law wasn't about cleanliness as virtue. It was about preventing epidemic disease in populations living under conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors, and the law existed because without legal enforcement some people would skip bathing and infect everyone around them. Chapter 6. The Dueling Ground Rules. Let us now turn to one of the most formalised aspects of Viking violence, the holmgang, or formal duel. This wasn't chaotic street fighting, but a highly regulated combat system, with specific rules about location, equipment, procedure, and outcome. The regulations seem almost absurdly detailed. The duelling ground must be a cloak or hide marked with hazel poles at the corners. Each combatant receives 3 shields that could be replaced when broken. First blood could end the duel, as could 3 broken shields, and witnesses were mandatory to verify the outcome. These elaborate rules might seem like honour-bound theatre until you understand the brutal mathematics that made them necessary. Picture a disputed property boundary in Norway, spring of 950 CE. 2 farmers have argued for months about who owns a particular meadow. Good grazing land that could mean the difference between their livestock surviving winter or starving. Words have escalated to threats to violence barely restrained. Without some formal resolution, this dispute will end in ambush murder, and ambush murder will trigger blood feud between their families. The Thing Assembly suggests holmgang, formal combat under witness, winner takes the disputed property, loser accepts defeat and lives. Both men agree, knowing that refusal means appearing cowardly and losing community support for their claim. The dueling ground is prepared with careful ritual. A cloak is spread on the ground, roughly 3 meters square, marked at corners with hazel poles that carry religious significance. Hazel was sacred to Thor, god of warriors and protectors of free men. The 2 combatants arrive with their shields, typically 3 each, and their chosen weapons, usually swords, though axes or spears were permitted. Witnesses gather in a circle around the marked ground. The rules are recited publicly. Combat begins when both men stand on the cloak. First blood ends the duel, unless both agree to continue. Breaking all 3 shields counts as defeat. Stepping off the cloak counts as retreat and loss. This sounds almost civilized. Formalized combat with clear stopping points, rules designed to prevent death. And indeed, many holmgangs ended with first blood, minor wounds that satisfied honour while preserving life. The winner gained property or compensation, the loser accepted defeat and retained his life and legal standing. The system worked as intended in these cases, channeling violence into controlled ritual that resolved disputes without killing. But here's what made this truly brutal. The holmgang system actually increased deaths in the short term but prevented blood feuds that killed dozens. Without formalised duelling, property disputes ended in ambush killings. One man murdered while working his fields, the other family seeking revenge back and forth until both family lines were decimated. A single property dispute could trigger feuds lasting generations and killing 30 or 40 people. The holmgang killed perhaps 1 man per dispute, maybe both if they refused first blood rules, but it prevented the cascading violence of uncontrolled revenge killings. The sagas preserve numerous holmgang accounts, and they're rarely glorious. Egil's saga describes Egil fighting multiple duels, often against opponents who used holmgang as legal extortion, challenging wealthy men for their property knowing they could either fight and possibly die, or surrender their wealth without combat. Some champions made entire careers of holmgang challenges, essentially legal robbery backed by sword skill. The system that was supposed to resolve disputes fairly became a tool for predatory violence by skilled fighters against less capable opponents. The law recognised this abuse but couldn't eliminate it without removing the holmgang option entirely, and removing it meant returning to uncontrolled blood feuds. So the compromise was regulation, limiting how often the same person could be challenged, setting rules about who could challenge whom, establishing compensation amounts for those who chose not to fight. The system wasn't good. It was simply less catastrophic than the alternative. Even with all the rules, holmgang deaths were common enough that legal procedures existed for handling them. If a man died in formal duel, his killer faced no murder charges. It was legal death under witness, part of accepted dispute resolution. The dead man's family received no compensation unless the holmgang itself was ruled improper in some way. This legal immunity for duel deaths demonstrates how thoroughly violence was integrated into the justice system. Killing in duel wasn't murder, it was a form of legal proceeding. It's hard not to see the desperate pragmatism in the system. The Norse understood that human nature and property disputes made violence inevitable. Feuding culture meant every killing demanded revenge, creating spirals that could depopulate regions. The holmgang channeled that violence into single combats under witness, trading 1 or 2 deaths for potential dozens. It wasn't about justice or honour, it was about limiting catastrophe, accepting that some violence was inevitable and trying to contain it within ritualised bounds that prevented wider social collapse. Chapter 7. The Shared Wall Law. Our next rule takes us into the realm of structural survival. The Shared Wall Law, which regulated communal longhouse construction and maintenance. Many longhouses weren't single-family structures, but communal buildings housing multiple families, sometimes related, sometimes simply neighbours sharing resources. The walls were shared infrastructure, typically turf and timber construction where outer walls were built and maintained collectively. Regulations specified maintenance schedules, repair obligations and penalties for neglecting your portion of the shared structure. This seems like basic property law, until you understand the brutal consequences of structural failure in Norse climate. Imagine a longhouse in northern Norway December, 5 months into winter. The structure is essentially a long rectangular building, perhaps 20 metres long and 6 metres wide, with walls made of stacked turf blocks and timber framing. The roof is turf and thatch, thick and heavy, designed to provide insulation. Inside, multiple families occupy platforms along the walls, their living spaces separated by hanging fabric or wooden partitions but sharing the central hearth. Smoke rises to escape through holes in the roof, though much of it simply accumulates in the upper air, making breathing difficult. The structure is their only protection against temperatures that regularly drop below -20 Celsius. The walls themselves were remarkable feats of desperate engineering. Turf blocks, cut from bogs or meadows, were stacked like bricks and held together with wooden framing. These walls could be a metre thick or more, providing substantial insulation when properly maintained. But turf was organic material. It decomposed, it settled, it absorbed moisture and froze in winter. The freeze-thaw cycles could crack the walls, creating gaps where wind whistled through. The timber framing rotted over years, weakening the structure's integrity. Constant maintenance was required to keep the walls functional, and if one section of shared wall failed, it threatened everyone sheltering inside. The law specified exactly who was responsible for which section of wall, how often inspections must occur, what constituted adequate repair, and what penalties applied for neglect. If your section of wall failed and caused harm to others in the longhouse, you could be liable for compensation. If your negligence caused structural collapse, you could face serious legal consequences, fines, compensation payments, even outlawry if deaths occurred. This wasn't about property values or aesthetic standards. It was about preventing people from freezing to death because their neighbours didn't maintain their wall section. But here's what made this truly brutal. Even well-maintained walls were so poorly insulated that ice formed inside on sleeping platforms. Excavated longhouse remains and experimental archaeology have demonstrated the horrifying reality of Norse winter living. Even with fires burning constantly, even with walls maintained to perfect standards, the interior temperature rarely rose above freezing except immediately adjacent to the hearth. People slept 3 feet from fires and still woke to find ice crystals on their blankets. They breathed smoke-filled air that damaged lungs over years. They lived in dim, cold, dark spaces for months at a time, emerging into brief winter daylight only when necessary. The archaeological evidence is stark. Excavated longhouse floors show frost heaving. Ground frozen so deeply that ice lenses form beneath the floor surface. Sleeping platform remains showburn marks where people tried to warm their beds with heated stones wrapped in cloth, often leading to fires that burned the entire structure. The timber framing shows rot patterns indicating chronic moisture problems from condensation and inadequate ventilation. These weren't comfortable homes. They were survival shelters where people endured rather than lived. The maintenance laws existed because structural failure meant death. A collapsed roof could bury sleeping families under tons of frozen turf and timber. A major wall breach during a winter storm could drop interior temperatures to lethal levels within hours. Children, elderly and sick people died first when structures failed, but healthy adults weren't far behind. The experimental longhouse reconstructions at Alonso Meadows and other sites have demonstrated how fragile these structures actually were. Modern reconstructions, even with better materials and techniques, struggle to maintain interior temperatures, and those are empty tourist attractions, not overcrowded shelters, packed with people and animals generating humidity and smoke. The shared wall law recognised a brutal fact. In communal structures, your neighbour's negligence could kill you. If they didn't maintain their wall section, if they didn't contribute to repairs, if they cut corners on construction quality, the entire structure was weakened. The law made shared infrastructure a collective obligation, enforced through legal sanction, because individual irresponsibility endangered everyone. This wasn't about being a good neighbour. It was about preventing mass death from structural collapse in buildings that were barely adequate even when perfectly maintained. So the next time you read saga descriptions of longhouse feasts and gatherings, remember the reality. These were dark, cold, smoke-filled structures where ice formed on the inside walls, where structural failure could bury you in frozen rubble, where maintenance wasn't optional but legally enforced survival necessity, and where even perfect construction meant enduring conditions that would be considered uninhabitable by any modern standard. Chapter 8. The Animal Slaughter Schedule. Let us now examine one of the most grimly practical regulations in Norse agriculture, the animal slaughter schedule, specifically the legally mandated timing of autumn culling. This wasn't a suggestion or a cultural tradition. In many communities there were explicit expectations about when livestock must be slaughtered, typically in late October or early November, a period sometimes called Blot Manada, blood month. The schedule wasn't about religious ritual or preference, but about stark mathematical necessity in an agricultural system that simply could not sustain animals through winter. Picture a Norse farm in late October. The grass has stopped growing, the hay harvest was completed weeks ago, and now farmers must make the most brutal calculation of their year. How many animals can possibly survive until spring, and how many must die now? The livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, stand in pens and pastures, oblivious to their approaching fate. The farmer walks among them making assessments. This cow is a good milker, she lives. This bull is breeding stock, he lives. These 3 sheep are young and healthy, they live. Everything else must die. The mathematics were unforgiving. A cow requires roughly 20 pounds of hay per day to survive winter. In northern Scandinavia, winter lasted 5 to 6 months. Let's say 150 days to be conservative. That's 3,000 pounds of hay per cow, or roughly 1.5 tons. A sheep needs about 3 pounds per day, so 450 pounds for winter. Multiply these requirements by your total livestock. Perhaps 20 sheep, 5 cows, 2 horses, several goats and pigs, and the hay requirements become enormous. A typical farm might need 10 to 15 tons of hay to maintain full livestock through winter. But achieving that harvest was nearly impossible. The growing season was short. Hay required dry weather for cutting and drying, and Norse farming technology was primitive. Scythes were expensive iron tools that required constant sharpening. Hay storage in barns and lofts was vulnerable to mould, rot, and vermin. Even in good years, most farms harvested perhaps 70% of what they needed for full livestock maintenance. In bad years, wet autumns, early frosts, late springs, the harvest might be half that. This is where the slaughter schedule became mandatory. Farmers couldn't wait until midwinter to discover they lacked sufficient fodder. By then, animals would be thin and weak, meat quality degraded, and crucially, the wasted fodder fed to doomed animals could have sustained breeding stock. The law mandated autumn assessment and immediate culling because delay meant losing both the animals that had to die anyway, and potentially the breeding stock that should have survived. But here's what made this truly brutal. The autumn cull killed up to 80% of livestock every single year. Only the most essential animals survived winter. Breeding females, essential working stock. A few males for breeding purposes. Everything else died, their meat preserved through salting, drying and smoking to feed humans through winter. This wasn't selective culling of surplus. It was systematic destruction of most animals you'd worked all year to raise, knowing you'd have to start over each spring. The preservation process itself was grim. Slaughter happened over a period of days or weeks. Multiple animals butchered per day when you had help from neighbours. Blood was collected for blood sausages and puddings, too valuable to waste. Every organ was used: hearts, livers, kidneys, intestines, lungs, even brains. Hides were processed for leather, bones were boiled for marrow and broken for tools. Nothing could be discarded because nothing was surplus. The sheer quantity of death, dozens of animals killed on a single farm, hundreds in a small community, made autumn a season of blood and butchery. Zooarchaeological evidence confirms this pattern brutally. Excavated Norse farms show distinct slaughter layers in autumn contexts. Concentrated deposits of butchered animal bones showing kill marks, skinning patterns, marrow extraction, and processing for preservation. The age profiles of these bones show systematic killing of young animals, yearlings and juveniles who are too costly to feed through winter, but not yet at peak meat production. The pattern is identical across Norse sites from Iceland to Sweden. Mass autumn slaughter, minimal winter survival, desperate spring breeding to rebuild herds. The timing law existed because miscalculation meant starvation. Kill too early, and you're feeding yourself from slaughter meat when animals could have grazed and fattened for weeks more. Kill too late and you waste fodder on animals doomed to die anyway. Fodder that could have sustained breeding stock. Get the timing wrong by even 1 week, and you might lose breeding females who starved on insufficient fodder, dooming next year's livestock production. The law didn't mandate specific dates, but established community-wide coordination so everyone culled together, preventing competitive hoarding of grazing rights or hay supplies. It's hard not to feel the weight of this system. Modern farming involves selective culling, strategic breeding, market timing. Norse farming involved raising animals all summer, knowing most would die in autumn, killing them yourself in mass slaughter events, and hoping desperately that the meat would last through winter, and your breeding stock would survive to reproduce in spring. The slaughter schedule wasn't tradition. It was survival arithmetic enforced by law, because individual miscalculation endangered family survival. And the law existed because every autumn was a planned massacre, driven by the simple, horrifying fact that winter feeding was impossible for most livestock. Chapter 9. The Funeral Timing Law. Our next rule takes us into the intersection of death and property. The Funeral Timing Law, which regulated when and how bodies could be buried relative to inheritance proceedings. This wasn't about religious requirements or mourning customs, but about legal necessity. Burials were often deliberately delayed, sometimes for weeks, until proper inheritance ceremonies could be performed with adequate witnesses. The law specified waiting periods, witness requirements, and property division procedures that must occur before or during the funeral. This seems callously legalistic until you understand the blood feuds that inheritance disputes triggered. Imagine a prosperous farmer dies in late winter, leaving behind a substantial estate, land, livestock, tools, stored goods, perhaps silver hoards or trade goods. He has 3 sons from his first marriage, 2 sons from his second marriage, a surviving wife, plus obligations to thralls and various relatives. His body lies in an outbuilding, frozen solid, while his family gathers witnesses and prepares for the inheritance ceremony. This isn't lack of respect or delayed mourning. It's legal necessity. Without proper witness to the property division, without formal ceremonies establishing inheritance rights, the family will be fighting in court for years or fighting with swords for weeks. The funeral timing law emerged from brutal experience. Early deaths that led to immediate burials often resulted in inheritance disputes that couldn't be resolved, because key witnesses hadn't arrived, because property hadn't been formally assessed, because competing claimants had no agreed-upon division. These disputes turned violent with depressing regularity. Brothers killed brothers over disputed livestock. Widows were dispossessed by grown stepsons who claimed their father's entire estate. Extended family members appeared from distant farms claiming inheritance rights that nobody could verify or refute. The law attempted to prevent this chaos by mandating that certain legal procedures occur before final burial. The deceased's property must be inventoried with witnesses present. Claims against the estate must be recorded and assessed. Inheritance divisions must be proposed and agreed upon, at least provisionally. Only then could the actual funeral proceed, and the funeral itself became a legal ceremony, where the property division was announced publicly, witnesses confirmed the arrangements, and the community acknowledged the new ownership structure. But here's what made this truly brutal. Bodies were stored in outbuildings for weeks awaiting these legal ceremonies, and winter death stayed frozen until spring thaw when mass burials occurred. The frozen body in the outbuilding wasn't a horror, it was a convenience. Winter death meant natural preservation while legal procedures were completed. The body didn't decay, didn't smell, didn't require immediate action. You could wait for distant relatives to arrive, for weather to permit assembly gathering, for witnesses to make dangerous winter journeys. The frozen corpse was patient evidence of death, available for inspection if disputes arose about cause of death or injury. Spring thaw, however, brought mass burial necessity. All the winter dead, and there were many, because winter killed the vulnerable reliably, thawed simultaneously. Bodies stored for months began to decay rapidly once temperatures rose. The spring thing assembly often became a funeral assembly as well, with multiple burials performed in quick succession, inheritance ceremonies conducted back to back, and the community dealing with months of accumulated death in a concentrated period. The archaeological evidence is fascinating and disturbing. Ship burials like the Osberg burial show evidence of months of preparation. The ship was modified, goods were collected, the burial chamber was constructed, all requiring time and resources. These weren't immediate interments, but planned ceremonies that occurred long after death. The preservation state of some bog bodies suggests they were stored before burial, perhaps awaiting legal resolution. The concentration of burials in certain seasons suggests seasonal burial patterns, driven partly by legal requirements and partly by frozen ground that made winter interment nearly impossible. The Osberg ship burial specifically demonstrates the legal importance of funeral timing. The buried woman, probably a queen or high-status individual, was interred with enormous wealth and ceremony, but the burial occurred weeks or months after her death. The ship had to be transported overland, modified for burial purposes, filled with grave goods that were collected from various sources. This wasn't delayed by accident, but by design. The funeral was a political and legal ceremony as much as a religious one, establishing succession, displaying wealth and power, and cementing social relationships. Through witnessed participation, The law recognised that inheritance disputes killed more people than the original deaths. A wealthy farmer dying peacefully in his bed might trigger a blood feud that killed his 10 sons and 20 grandsons as they fought over property division. Brothers who'd lived peacefully for decades would murder each other over disputed land boundaries or livestock counts. Widows would be driven from their homes or killed by stepsons claiming exclusive inheritance rights. The funeral timing law couldn't prevent all such violence, but by forcing legal procedures before burial, it reduced disputes and created public records of inheritance that were harder to contest later. So the next time you read about elaborate Viking funerals in saga literature, remember the reality. Bodies stored frozen in outbuildings for weeks, inheritance disputes taking precedence over mourning, spring thaws bringing mass burials of winter dead who'd waited months for legal ceremonies, and funeral timing laws existing because property fights over dead men's estates killed more people than battles, and the law existed to create public witness and formal procedures that prevented brothers from murdering each other over their father's frozen corpse. Chapter 10. The Slave Injury Compensation. Our final rule in this second group takes us into perhaps the darkest aspect of Norse law, the slave injury compensation system. Thralls, enslaved people captured in raids or born into slavery, were legally property, and like all property, damaging someone else's thrall required compensation to the owner. The law codes specified precise compensation amounts for different injuries. A broken arm was worth this much silver, a lost eye was worth that much. Permanent disability had its own calculation. These regulations seem coldly commercial until you understand the perverse economic incentives that made them necessary. Picture a Norse farm where thralls do most of the heavy labour. These aren't voluntary servants but captive workers, often taken in raids on Ireland, Britain or Baltic settlements. They sleep in the worst spots in the longhouse, eat last and least, work the hardest and longest hours. They have no legal rights, cannot own property, cannot refuse orders, cannot leave. They are capital assets, like livestock, but more valuable because they can perform complex labour. A strong, skilled thrall might be worth as much as a good ship, representing enormous investment. Now imagine you've lent your thrall to a neighbour to help with construction work. Your thrall is carrying timber when a badly secured load shifts and crushes his hand. Several fingers are broken, one is severed completely. The thrall can still work, but his efficiency is permanently reduced. He can't grip tools properly, can't perform fine manipulation tasks. His labour value has decreased substantially. In modern terms, you've just experienced significant capital depreciation due to your neighbour's negligence. You want compensation for the damaged asset. The injury compensation law provided precise tables for such situations. Different injuries had different valuations based on how much they reduced a thrall's working capacity. Loss of a hand was more expensive than loss of fingers because it eliminated more types of labour. Blindness in both eyes essentially destroyed a thrall's value, requiring nearly full replacement compensation. Permanent lameness reduced value by specific percentages depending on severity. These weren't moral judgments about suffering, but cold economic calculations about lost productivity. But here's what made this truly brutal. Thralls were so valuable as capital that owners kept them alive to preserve asset value, not from mercy. An injured thrall who could still work was valuable property worth maintaining. But a thrall who couldn't work, who was permanently disabled, who required constant care, who consumed food without producing labour, that thrall was killed rather than fed through winter. The law acknowledged this as normal practice. Compensation for a thrall injured beyond ability to work was calculated at full replacement value because everyone understood the injured thrall would be killed once compensation was paid. The skeleton evidence tells this story with heartbreaking clarity. Thrall burials, identified by location, burial goods and skeletal markers, show healed but debilitating injuries that nonetheless allowed continued labour. Broken ribs that healed crooked but allowed breathing. crushed feet that healed but left permanent limping, spinal injuries that limited mobility but didn't prevent upper body work. These people survived injuries because they could still provide labour value. But excavations rarely find thrall skeletons with injuries that would have prevented all work. Those people didn't survive to burial. They were killed while injured and disposed of in ways that left no archaeological trace. The compensation law also reveals the economic logic of slavery in resource-poor environments. Thralls were worth maintaining only as long as they produced more value than they consumed. In summer, when food was abundant and labour demands high, even injured thralls might be fed. In winter, when food was scarce and labour demands minimal, disabled thralls became liabilities rather than assets. The harsh calculus of survival meant that people who couldn't contribute to food production became food drains that endangered everyone else. And thralls, lacking legal protection or family advocates, were first to be eliminated. The law codes make this brutally explicit in discussing thrall injury compensation. The compensation amount for permanent disability essentially equals replacement value because, as the law acknowledges, the disabled thrall will be put out of the way. This phrase appears repeatedly in legal contexts not cared for or maintained, but put out of the way, a euphemism for killing that everyone understood. The law didn't prohibit this killing because thralls were property, and property that had lost its utility could be disposed of without legal consequence. Some saga accounts preserve this dynamic in action, usually as background detail rather than main plot. A thrall is injured in a farm accident. The owner demands compensation from the negligent party. Compensation is paid, and the thrall disappears from the narrative, dead and unmourned because his death was expected outcome rather than tragedy. Occasionally a saga preserves stories of owners showing unexpected mercy to injured thralls, but these stories are remarkable precisely because they are exceptions. The expected pattern was economic logic: injury reducing value, compensation recovering loss, disposal of unprofitable asset. It's hard not to feel sick recognition of the system's logic. Slavery is horror enough, but slavery in resource-poor environments where survival margins are thin creates particularly brutal economics. Injured slaves in wealthy societies might be kept alive because their owners could afford mercy. In Norse Scandinavia, where one bad harvest meant starvation, where winter killed the vulnerable reliably, where every mouth to feed was balanced against available food, injured thralls who couldn't work were killed as economic necessity. The compensation law acknowledged this reality and simply provided mechanisms for recovering financial losses from negligent injury, treating human beings as damaged property with calculable replacement value and expected disposal after compensation. Chapter 11. The Wood Theft Laws. Let us now examine one of the harshest property laws in Norse society: the extreme penalties for unauthorised timber cutting. Stealing wood, whether firewood, building timber, or even fallen branches from another's forest, carried penalties far exceeding the apparent value of the stolen material. In many regions, significant wood theft could result in outlawry, the same punishment given for serious assault or manslaughter. This seems grotesquely disproportionate until you understand the resource scarcity that made timber theft functionally equivalent to murder. Imagine a forest in western Norway, late autumn. The trees here are sparse compared to more southern regions, slow-growing pine and birch struggling in thin soil and short-growing seasons. A farmer marks his woodland carefully, blazing trees with his ownership mark, establishing boundaries that his neighbours recognise. This forest represents years of careful management, selective cutting, allowing regeneration, protecting young trees from browsing animals. It's not wilderness to be exploited freely, but capital investment as valuable as his livestock or farmland. Now imagine a neighbour, desperate for winter firewood, slips into this marked forest at night and fells several trees. Perhaps his own wood supply ran short due to poor planning, or his family grew and needed more fuel than anticipated. or he simply saw an opportunity for easy acquisition. He drags the timber home under darkness, cuts it for firewood, and burns it through winter. Come spring, the forest owner discovers the theft. Trees cut without permission, regeneration damaged by careless felling, years of growth stolen in a single night. The penalty, when the thief was caught and convicted, was devastating. Outlawry for significant timber theft meant exile, property confiscation, loss of all legal protection. This wasn't just punishment for stealing wood, it was recognition that wood theft could mean another family's death. The stolen timber represented survival fuel for winter. Without it, the victim's family might freeze. Children, elderly, the sick, all were vulnerable to cold that killed when firewood ran out. In this context, timber theft wasn't simple property crime but potential mass murder through negligent endangerment. The mathematics were brutal. A family needed roughly 1 full cartload of firewood per week during deep winter, perhaps 500 kilograms of wood. Over a 5-month winter, that's 20 cartloads, or 10 metric tons of wood. This wood had to be cut in summer or autumn, split, dried and stored. The labour investment was enormous. Weeks of work with hand tools, careful selection of trees, processing and storage. Stealing 1 cartload wasn't just theft of wood, but theft of that labour, theft of warmth, theft of survival margin that might make the difference between living and freezing. The deforestation evidence makes this scarcity visible archaeologically. Pollen core samples from Norse-era Scandinavia show dramatic declines in tree populations around settlements. Iceland's landscape transformation is most dramatic. Arriving Norse settlers found an island perhaps 40% forested, but within 3 centuries forests had shrunk to less than 5% of land area. This wasn't sustainable harvesting but resource exhaustion, driven by desperate need for fuel, building material and charcoal production. Every region experienced similar pressures. Norway's forests retreated upslope and northward. Sweden's accessible timber became scarce around major settlements. The saga literature preserves numerous wood theft feuds spanning generations. In Grettir's saga, disputes over forest rights lead to violence, legal cases, and long-running enmity between families. The sagas treat these disputes as deadly serious, not petty squabbles, because timber scarcity made forest rights literally vital. Property marking systems developed elaborate sophistication. Boundary stones, blazed trees, written or witnessed agreements, all attempting to prevent disputes that regularly turned violent. Men killed each other over tree-cutting rights because trees meant survival. The law recognised that timber theft created life-or-death situations. Stealing firewood could doom the victim's family to freezing death during the winter, months. Stealing building timber could prevent necessary repairs that kept families sheltered. Stealing charcoal-making wood could eliminate iron-working capacity essential for tools. The harsh penalties weren't disproportionate in context. They reflected the reality that in resource-scarce environments, wood theft was attempted murder with extra steps, and the law treated it accordingly. So the next time you adjust your thermostat without thought, remember the Norse reality. Fuel scarcity so severe that stealing firewood carried outlawry penalties, forests so depleted that finding adequate timber required travelling farther each year, and winters where running out of firewood before spring meant freezing to death in your own home, and the law existed because 1 stolen cartload could mean another family's death, making timber theft functionally equivalent to murder. Chapter 12. The Travel Companion Law. Our next rule addresses the dangers of Viking Age travel. The legal requirement for minimum group sizes on journeys. Solo travel, particularly over long distances or through wilderness, was not merely discouraged but legally prohibited in many contexts. Free men were required to travel in groups of at least 2, with larger groups mandated for dangerous routes or valuable cargo. Violating this requirement could result in fines or loss of legal protection for any harm that befell you. This seems paternalistic until you understand the legal vacuum created by solo traveller deaths. Picture a merchant travelling from a coastal trading centre to an inland farm settlement carrying trade goods, salt, iron tools, perhaps some luxury items like glass beads or silver ornaments. The journey takes 3 days through forest paths, crossing rivers, passing through valleys where farms are sparse. This merchant travels alone because bringing a companion means splitting profits or paying for assistance. He's an experienced traveller who knows the routes, carries weapons for self-defence, and believes he can manage the journey safely. Halfway through, he's ambushed, robbed, and killed, his body hidden off the trail where it won't be found for months or years. The legal problem is immediate and unsolvable. There are no witnesses. The merchant's family knows he left on his journey. They know he never arrived at his destination, but they don't know where he died, how he died, or who killed him. Without witnesses, they cannot bring a case against anyone. Without a body, they cannot even prove death occurred. Maybe he fled with the trade goods. Maybe he's living elsewhere under a different name. The ambiguity creates legal paralysis. The murderers go free because there's no evidence, no testimony, no proof of crime. The travel companion law attempted to solve this problem by mandating witnesses. 2 people travelling together meant one could survive an ambush to testify, or if both died, the dual disappearance was itself suspicious evidence. The companion could report what happened, identify attackers if known, recover the body for proper burial and legal proceedings. More importantly, the presence of companions made ambush murder significantly more difficult and dangerous for attackers. Killing one man was relatively easy. Killing 2 and ensuring no witnesses escaped was much harder. But here's what made this truly brutal. The law existed because solo travellers who died couldn't report crimes against them, meaning their deaths meant murderers went free and robbed with impunity. This created a perverse incentive structure where known travel routes became hunting grounds for opportunistic killers. A merchant travelling alone with valuable goods was a target of opportunity. Kill him, take his goods, hide his body, and face no legal consequences because there were no witnesses to bring charges. The travel companion law tried to disrupt this pattern by making solo travel itself a legal violation, but it couldn't eliminate the underlying problem. Archaeological evidence supports this grim picture. Excavations along known Viking Age travel routes reveal occasional isolated burials, showing signs of violence, skeletal trauma consistent with weapon wounds, hasty burial without grave goods, positioning off main trails in locations suggesting concealment. These may represent travellers ambushed and killed, their bodies hastily buried by murderers or eventually found and buried by later travellers. The actual death toll was certainly higher because many bodies were never recovered, dumped in rivers, buried in unmarked locations, or simply left for scavengers in remote areas. The saga literature preserves this dynamic repeatedly. Characters ambush solo travellers, rob them, and kill them with the explicit understanding that no witnesses means no legal consequences. Njál's saga, Laxdæla saga, and Grettir's saga all contain episodes of travellers murdered on remote paths, with the murderers escaping justice precisely because they ensured no witnesses survived. When saga heroes kill unjustly, they often do so on isolated paths where they believe no testimony will emerge to incriminate them. The law also reveals practical limitations of ancient legal systems. Modern criminal justice has forensic science, investigative techniques, and state enforcement mechanisms that don't require eyewitnesses. Norse law relied almost entirely on testimony, witnesses who could speak at the Thing assembly about what they'd seen or heard. Without witnesses, cases rarely proceeded to judgment. The travel companion law was a crude but practical solution. Create witnesses by mandating group travel, making prosecution possible by ensuring someone survived to testify. It's hard not to see the desperation in this rule. The legal system understood it couldn't actually prevent murders. Violence was too integrated into the culture. Weapons were too readily available. Disputes too frequent. but it could try to ensure murders were witnessed and therefore prosecutable. The travel companion law wasn't about safety through numbers, though that was a benefit. It was about creating legal accountability through forced witnessing, acknowledging that without testimony, murderers walked free, and the law existed because solo traveller deaths created legal vacuums where justice was impossible, and criminal violence flourished unpunished. Chapter 13. The Livestock Bell Requirement. Let us now turn to a regulation that seems almost quaint: the mandatory bells on free-ranging animals. Livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, horses, were required to wear bells when allowed to graze in forest or common land. The bells had to be loud enough to hear at distance and sturdy enough to survive rough conditions. Failure to bell your animals could result in loss of grazing rights or liability for damages if unbelled animals caused problems. This seems like simple animal management, until you understand the survival arithmetic of finding dead livestock. Imagine a Norse farm in late autumn, the period when every resource mattered desperately. Your livestock are still on forest grazing, fattening on the last grass before winter confinement. You have perhaps 20 sheep, 5 cows, several goats scattered through the woodland surrounding your farm. Each animal wears an iron bell, expensive but essential equipment. Every morning you count the bells, listening for the distinctive tones that tell you each animal is alive and moving. One morning, a bell goes silent. A cow hasn't moved or rang its bell in hours. You follow the sound to find the cow dead, killed by a wolf or bear during the night, its carcass still fresh. This dead cow is survival resource, not loss. You butcher it immediately, salvaging every bit of meat, hide, organs, bones. The meat can be preserved and stored, adding to your winter food supply. The hide becomes leather for clothing or trade. The bones become tools or are boiled for marrow. Nothing is wasted because nothing is surplus. The bell led you to this resource before scavengers consumed it, before decomposition made the meat unsafe, before wolves scattered the carcass into inedible fragments. That bell just saved your family from potential winter hunger. Now imagine the same scenario without the bell. The cow dies in the forest somewhere within several square kilometres of your farm. You don't know it's dead until you count animals and come up one short. You search for days, covering enormous territory, hoping to find the carcass. By the time you locate it, if you locate it, wolves have been feeding for days. The meat is largely consumed or contaminated. The hide is torn and useless. The bones are scattered. What should have been valuable survival resource has become total loss because you couldn't find the carcass before scavengers did. But here's what made this truly brutal. Unbelled livestock that wandered and died meant starvation risk, and bells let you find dead animals for meat before. Wolves did. Every carcass was the difference between survival and starvation. The margin was that thin. One missing cow meant perhaps 200 pounds of meat lost. That's food for weeks, potentially the difference between making it to spring or starving in late winter when stored food ran out. The bell requirement wasn't about preventing livestock loss, which was inevitable, but about minimising waste when loss occurred. The archaeological evidence is striking. Excavations of Norse farms reveal thousands of livestock bells, iron bells in various sizes, bronze bells for more valuable animals, even wooden bells with iron clappers. The sheer quantity demonstrates this wasn't optional equipment, but standard infrastructure. Chemical analysis of bell corrosion patterns shows they were worn by animals year-round, not seasonally applied. These bells were in constant use, suffering wear from years of service, indicating how essential they were to daily farming operations. The bells served other functions too. They deterred predators by making animals audible from distance, allowing shepherds to detect wolf approaches by sudden bell silences or panicked ringing. They helped locate animals for gathering in evening or during storms. They identified ownership when animals wandered onto neighbouring land. But the primary function was finding carcasses, detecting death quickly enough to salvage value from the loss. In an economy operating at survival margins, the difference between found and unfound carcasses could mean family survival or death. The law mandating bells existed because unbelled animals that died became waste, and waste meant starvation. Farmers who didn't bell their livestock endangered not just themselves but the community food supply. Lost animals that should have fed families instead fed wolves. The collective impact of such waste, multiplied across dozens of farms, could tip entire communities from adequate to insufficient food supplies. The bell requirement was enforced through law because individual negligence created community risk, and survival margins were too thin to tolerate preventable waste. So the next time you hear romantic descriptions of Viking Age pastoral farming, remember the reality. Livestock scattered through forests kilometres from the farm, expensive iron bells as essential equipment, desperate searches for dead animals to salvage meat before wolves consumed it, and bell laws existing because every carcass mattered. Every pound of meat was survival resource, and finding dead animals before scavengers did was literally the difference between living and starving through winter's final months. Chapter 14. The Sick House Separation. Our next rule takes us into the darkest corners of medical practice, the isolation requirements for ill family members. When someone developed serious illness, fever, respiratory disease, vomiting sickness, or other conditions suggesting contagion, they were legally required to be moved to separate structures, often called sick houses or fever sheds. These weren't medical facilities, but isolation shelters where the sick could be segregated from healthy family members. Food could be delivered, but direct contact was minimised. This seems like reasonable quarantine until you understand what sick house actually meant in practice. Picture a Norse farmstead in midwinter. A child develops high fever, begins coughing violently, shows signs of pneumonia or perhaps tuberculosis. The family faces an immediate decision: keep the child in the longhouse with everyone else, or move them to the sick house. The longhouse is warm, communal, with the hearth fire and human bodies providing heat even in brutal cold. The sick house is a separate outbuilding, perhaps a storage shed hastily modified, perhaps a structure built specifically for this purpose, with minimal heating, no community warmth, isolation from family care. The law mandated separation for exactly the reason you'd expect. Infectious diseases could race through crowded longhouses, killing half the inhabitants within weeks. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza, even bacterial infections like strep throat could spread rapidly when 20 people slept in close quarters sharing air. One sick child could infect 4 siblings, 2 parents, elderly grandparents, all within days. The collective risk was simply unacceptable. Better to isolate the sick person, sacrifice their comfort for community protection, and hope they recovered alone rather than starting an epidemic. But here's what made this truly brutal. Sick house often meant death house. Families sealed sick members in outbuildings to die alone rather than risk everyone. The medical isolation was abandonment with legal cover. Once someone was moved to the sick house, their chance of survival dropped dramatically. No constant care, no warmth from bodies and fire, no vigilant monitoring for deterioration. Food was left at the door. Someone checked daily to see if the patient was still alive, but actual nursing care was minimal or non-existent. The isolation that protected healthy family members also ensured sick members died from neglect, even when their original illness was survivable. The archaeological and literary evidence paints this picture clearly. Saga accounts describe fever sheds where multiple family members died in succession, each moved to isolation and perishing there. The descriptions are matter of fact, treating this as normal procedure rather than tragedy. Structural remains of Norse farms sometimes show small outbuildings positioned away from main dwellings, lacking hearths or sleeping platforms, suggesting temporary shelters used for sick members or dead body storage before burial. These weren't comfortable recovery spaces but grim holding areas. The system created horrible moral choices. A parent with a sick child had to decide, risk everyone's survival by keeping the child warm and cared for in the longhouse, or sacrifice the child's survival chances by isolating them in the cold, knowing this abandonment would likely kill them even if the original illness was treatable. A family with elderly grandparents showing illness symptoms had to weigh one life against many. The sick house law removed legal liability for this abandonment. You were following quarantine procedures, not committing negligent homicide, even though the practical outcome was the same. Modern medicine makes this seem monstrous. We can treat bacterial infections with antibiotics, viral infections with supportive care, provide heated isolation rooms with full medical attention. The Norse had none of these options. They understood empirically that isolation reduced disease spread, but couldn't provide isolation that didn't also mean death from cold and neglect. The sick house law was the best of terrible options. Accept individual deaths from abandonment to prevent family or community extinction from epidemic disease. The psychological toll must have been devastating. Imagine listening to your child cough alone in the sick house, knowing they're cold and frightened, knowing you could comfort them but choosing not to because it might kill everyone else. Imagine being the sick person, moved to isolation, understanding implicitly that this is probably goodbye, that your family has chosen their survival over yours. The saga literature rarely discusses the emotional reality of sick house isolation, treating it as unremarkable, but that silence itself speaks to how normalised this horror had become. So the next time you read about Viking Age families and households, remember the reality. Sick houses where family members died alone in cold isolation, medical quarantine indistinguishable from calculated abandonment, parents listening to children die in separate buildings because bringing them inside might kill everyone, and isolation laws existing because contagious disease could extinction. Event entire households, making abandonment of the sick into community survival necessity rather than moral choice. Chapter 15. The Inheritance Announcement. Rules. Our final rule in this third group returns us to property law, the public declaration requirements at thing assemblies for inheritance claims. When someone died leaving property, land, livestock, goods, silver, the inheritors were legally required to announce their claims publicly at the next thing assembly, with multiple witnesses present. The announcement had to specify exactly what was being claimed, on what basis, kinship relationship, prior agreement, gift, and be open to challenge by anyone with competing claims. This seems like bureaucratic procedure until you understand how frequently inheritance disputes turned into murders. Picture the thing assembly, hundreds of people gathered in summer for legal proceedings. A man stands before the assembly and announces his inheritance claim. My father died last winter. I claim his farm at Bjornsted, his 30 sheep, his 2 cows, his stored grain, his tools and household goods, his silver hoard of 12 marks. I am his legitimate son by his first wife, and these 3 men witnessed his statements that I should inherit. The announcement is specific, detailed, and public. Anyone who wants to challenge half-siblings, previous wives' children, distant cousins, creditors claiming debts, must speak now or forfeit their objections. The public nature of this announcement was critical. Without it, inheritance passed privately, according to family agreements, or simply whoever took possession first. This created endless disputes. A son might claim his father promised him the farm, while brothers insisted on equal division. A second wife might claim rights to property the first wife's children thought was theirs. Distant relatives might appear claiming they were secret heirs mentioned in deathbed statements nobody else witnessed. Without public declaration and witness testimony, these disputes had no resolution mechanism except violence. The thing assembly provided enforced publicity. The announcement happened before the entire community, recorded in collective memory if not written records. Challenges were heard immediately, with the assembly rendering judgment about which claims were legitimate. Witnesses testified about deathbed statements, marriage legitimacy, kinship relationships. The law required this process precisely because private inheritance transfers kept triggering blood feuds that killed entire family lines. But here's what made this truly brutal. Even with public announcement and witness testimony, inheritance disputes still regularly ended in ambush murders on the return journey from assemblies. The public proceeding revealed who won and who lost inheritance contests. The losers, embittered and potentially impoverished by the decision, knew exactly who'd claimed what property. The return journey from the Thing assembly, days of travel through wilderness paths, provided perfect ambush opportunities. Winners celebrating their successful inheritance claims were waylaid by armed relatives who'd lost their own claims, murdered on forest paths, their newly inherited property taken by force. The saga literature preserves this pattern repeatedly. A man wins a contested inheritance at the assembly, begins his journey home, and is ambushed by dispossessed relatives or rivals. Sometimes the murder happens at the assembly itself, in violation of weapon peace, when tempers overwhelm judgment. More often it happens during travel, when the winner has left the protected assembly ground and is vulnerable on isolated paths. The inheritance announcement that was supposed to prevent violence sometimes simply marked targets for murder. The archaeological evidence is indirect but suggestive. Wealthy burials showing signs of sudden violent death, weapons embedded in skeletons, hasty burial without full ceremony, positioning suggesting they died away from home, may represent inheritance dispute murders. The pattern of violence around property transfer appears consistently across Norse society, from Iceland to mainland Scandinavia. Property was simply too valuable, survival margins too thin for people to accept dispossession peacefully. The law couldn't prevent these murders entirely, but tried to make them prosecutable. The public announcement created witnesses who could testify about the murdered person's legitimate inheritance. Killing an announced heir was clear murder, not ambiguous property dispute. The Assembly's judgment gave the inheritance legal standing that personal violence couldn't entirely override. The murderer might take physical possession, but they'd face legal consequences at the next assembly. This sometimes deterred violence, though clearly not always. It's hard not to see the futility in this system. The law created elaborate procedures for peaceful property transfer, required public announcements with witnesses, established legal mechanisms for dispute resolution. But human nature and resource scarcity meant people killed each other anyway over inheritance. Brothers murdered brothers, children killed step-parents, distant relatives ambushed successful claimants. The inheritance announcement rules were society's desperate attempt to impose order on a process that regularly descended into blood violence, and the law existed because property disputes over dead men's estates killed more people than disease or starvation, making inheritance procedure a survival necessity rather than legal formality. Chapter 16. The Fish Trap Placement Law. Let us now examine regulations governing one of the most vital food sources, the Fish Trap Placement Law, which controlled where and how fishing equipment could be positioned in rivers and fjords. Salmon runs, herring migrations, and other seasonal fish movements were so crucial to survival that elaborate rules developed about trap positioning, net spacing, weir construction, and territorial access rights. Violating these regulations could result in equipment confiscation, fines, or violence from competing fishermen. This seems like resource management until you understand that upstream fish traps could literally starve downstream communities. Picture a Norwegian river in late summer, salmon returning from the ocean to spawn in their natal streams. These fish runs represented enormous food value. Thousands of fish moving upstream in concentrated periods, each fish providing protein, fat and calories essential for winter survival. Multiple communities lived along this river, from coastal settlements where it met the sea to inland farms dozens of kilometres upstream. Each community needed salmon to supplement their livestock and grain stores, and each had traditional fishing rights based on location and historical precedent. The fish trap technology itself was sophisticated. Weirs, fence-like structures of stakes and woven branches funneled fish into enclosures or nets where they could be harvested. These installations could be remarkably effective, capturing hundreds or thousands of fish during peak runs. But therein lay the problem. A well-positioned weir upstream could catch entire runs, leaving nothing for downstream communities. One farmer's successful fishing could doom his neighbours to insufficient winter protein, and insufficient protein meant starvation when grain stores ran low. The placement law attempted to distribute this resource more equitably. Regulations specified minimum distances between traps, prohibited complete river blockages that caught every fish, mandated periodic opening of weirs to allow some fish passage upstream, and established seasonal access rights that rotated to give different communities priority at different times. The law recognised that fish runs were collective resources requiring managed sharing, not individual property to be exploited without constraint. But here's what made this truly brutal. Even with regulations, upstream traps could starve downstream communities by catching entire salmon runs, and fish wars killed more people than the food secured. The enforcement mechanism was violence. If an upstream farmer built a weir that violated placement rules, downstream communities might dismantle it by force. If a community blocked access during another's rightful fishing time, armed confrontations resulted. The Thing assemblies heard countless fishing rights disputes, rendering judgments that were often ignored because hungry people with weapons didn't accept legal decisions that meant their children starving. Archaeological evidence shows extensive fish trap infrastructure throughout North Scandinavia. Excavated weir remains demonstrate sophisticated engineering, carefully positioned stakes, evidence of seasonal reconstruction, strategic placement at river narrows or falls where fish concentrated. The investment of labour and materials was substantial, indicating how valuable these installations were. Chemical analysis of some weir timbers shows evidence of burning, possibly from conflict destruction, possibly from seasonal clearing, but the damage patterns suggest deliberate sabotage in some cases. The saga literature preserves fish trap conflicts with depressing regularity. Neighbours come to blows over weir positioning. Extended families feud for generations over fishing rights. Assembly judgments about trap placement are ignored or violated, leading to violence that escalates beyond the original dispute. The pattern is consistent: vital resource, plus competing claims, plus inadequate enforcement. Blood conflict that continues until families are decimated or communities abandon the area entirely. The law also reveals the desperation of resource allocation in marginal environments. Modern fisheries management deals with sustainability, conservation, equitable distribution. Norse fish trap laws dealt with preventing immediate starvation and minimising violence over what everyone recognised was insufficient supply for all needs. The rules didn't create abundance. They tried to distribute scarcity in ways that kept everyone barely alive, rather than some communities well fed while others starved. It's hard not to see the mathematical brutality here. Salmon runs had finite biomass. Upstream traps caught fish that would otherwise swim to downstream traps. Every fish caught upstream was a fish not available downstream. The zero-sum nature of the resource made conflict inevitable, and the law's attempts at equitable distribution couldn't overcome the simple fact that there often weren't enough fish for everyone. The placement laws existed because fish wars killed more people than starvation would have, trading violent deaths for slow hunger deaths, and that was somehow the better option. Chapter 17. The Poison Accusation Protocol. Our next rule takes us into the dangerous intersection of medicine and law, the Poison Accusation Protocol, which established procedures for handling suspected poisoning cases. When someone died or fell mysteriously ill, and poisoning was suspected, formal legal procedures determined how accusations were made, how evidence was gathered, and how guilt was established. These weren't murder investigations as we'd recognise them, but quasi-religious proceedings involving ordeals, witness testimony about herb knowledge, and accusations that fell disproportionately on women. This seems like an attempt at justice until you understand that most poisonings were food contamination or natural illness, but alleged poisoners were executed anyway. Imagine a household in autumn after the first preserved foods have been opened. A previously healthy man falls violently ill, vomiting, convulsions, delirium, death within days. The family searches for explanations. Food poisoning seems possible, but which food, and was it accidental or intentional? Suspicion falls on the household women, wives, daughters, servants, who prepared meals and had access to the food stores. Perhaps there was a dispute, or inheritance conflict, romantic jealousy, some perceived motive. The accusation is made. Poisoning, deliberate murder through herbs or tainted food. The poison accusation protocol provided structured procedures for such cases. Accusers had to bring the case before the Thing Assembly, with witnesses who could testify to suspicious behaviour. The accused collecting unusual plants, making strange preparations, being seen near the victim's food or drink. The accused could defend themselves, but the burden of proof fell heavily on them. In many cases, trial by ordeal was mandated. The accused might be required to carry hot iron, plunge hands in boiling water, or undergo other painful tests where survival indicated divine judgment of innocence. The law code specified elaborate protocols for poison cases precisely because these accusations were so common. Women with a knowledge of medicinal herbs were particularly vulnerable. The same knowledge that could heal could theoretically harm, and herb-gathering activities that seemed innocent in one context looked sinister when someone subsequently died. Disputes over property, inheritance, marriage arrangements, or simple personality conflicts could motivate accusations that had legal cover as poisoning investigations but were essentially social violence. But here's what made this truly brutal. Most poisonings were actually food contamination from spoilage or natural disease, but they executed alleged poisoners anyway. The Norse understood empirically that certain foods sometimes made people sick or killed them, but they lacked germ theory, understood nothing of bacteria or toxins from decomposition, couldn't distinguish intentional poisoning from accidental contamination or natural illness that coincidentally followed meals. Someone dying after eating was suspicious, but that suspicion often led to executing innocent people whose only crime was cooking food that happened to be contaminated. The archaeological evidence provides chilling context. Analysis of Norse food storage reveals conditions perfect for bacterial growth. Inadequate preservation, temperature fluctuations, moisture accumulation. Botulism from improperly preserved meat, ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, toxic reactions from spoiled fish, all could produce symptoms easily misattributed to intentional poisoning. The skeletal remains of adult women sometimes show evidence of judicial execution, specific trauma patterns consistent with hanging or drowning rather than interpersonal violence, possibly representing convicted poisoners who were actually innocent victims of medical ignorance. The saga accounts preserve this pattern with disturbing frequency. Women accused of poisoning undergo ordeals, are convicted based on circumstantial evidence or forced confessions, and are executed by drowning or hanging. The sagas sometimes treat these accusations skeptically, suggesting the real motive was property disputes or romantic rivalry, but even skeptical accounts accept the legal process as legitimate. The possibility that the poisoning was natural causes doesn't seem to occur to anyone, or if it does, it's not mentioned. The gender dynamics make this particularly dark. Men could be accused of poisoning, but accusations fell overwhelmingly on women, especially those in vulnerable social positions, wives in troubled marriages, widows with disputed inheritance claims, servants with access to food preparation but no legal advocates. The poison accusation became a tool for removing inconvenient women under legal cover, and the protocol that was supposed to ensure justice actually enabled systematic miscarriage of justice based on medical ignorance and social prejudice. it's hard not to feel sick recognition of similar patterns in later European witch trials, but the Norse version predates those events by centuries. The same dynamics operated: mysterious illness or death, search for human agency rather than natural causes, accusations falling on vulnerable women with specialised knowledge, legal procedures that presumed guilt and required impossible proof of innocence, executions based on evidence that would be laughable if it weren't literally killing people. The poison accusation protocol existed because people died mysteriously, and communities needed someone to blame, and the law existed to make that blaming process systematic rather than chaotic, which somehow made the injustice worse. Chapter 18: The Weaponless Execution Rule. Let us now examine perhaps the strangest category of Norse law, the weaponless execution rule, which specified that certain criminals must be killed without using weapons. Execution methods included drowning in bogs, throwing from cliffs, hanging, or other techniques that didn't involve sword, axe, or spear. This wasn't mercy or squeamishness about violence. Vikings had no shortage of either, but religious and legal necessity. The method of execution had profound spiritual and practical implications that governed how killings were legally performed. Picture a thing assembly that has convicted a man of serious crimes, perhaps repeated theft, perhaps oath-breaking, perhaps murder, under circumstances that denied him honourable combat death. The assembly pronounces him not merely guilty, but needinga, a term indicating complete social death, someone so degraded they've lost all honour and human dignity. The punishment is death, but not clean death by sword. Instead, he will be taken to a bog, one of the deep acidic peat bogs that dot the Scandinavian landscape, bound, weighted, and pushed into the dark water to drown slowly in cold, suffocating darkness. This execution method was neither random nor cruel for cruelty's sake. It was theologically necessary. Death by weapon, particularly sword, was an honourable death that granted access to Valhalla or other respectable afterlife destinations. Warriors who died in battle with weapons in hand earned their place in Odin's Hall. But criminals executed for dishonourable offences couldn't be permitted such deaths. They needed degrading deaths that marked them as spiritually polluted, ensuring their exclusion from honourable afterlife and preventing their ghosts from haunting the living. Bog drowning served multiple functions. The criminal died without weapon wounds, marking the death as shameful. The bog itself was liminal space, neither land nor water associated with boundary crossing and supernatural danger. Bodies thrown in bogs often didn't decompose normally due to the preservative properties of peat, creating undead corpses that remained intact for years or centuries. This preservation was intentional. The criminal's body must remain in the bog, trapped in that liminal space, unable to rest or haunt the living community. But here's what made this truly brutal. Execution method determined religious afterlife, so legal death-dealing methods were theological necessity. The law specified weaponless execution, not from humanitarian concern but from spiritual pollution fears. A criminal killed by sword might claim warrior's death and access to Valhalla. A criminal drowned in a bog was marked as nidinga in death as in life, excluded from all honourable destinations, transformed into a cautionary example of ultimate social death. The execution method was spiritual insurance against the executed person's ghost, seeking revenge, or their soul claiming undeserved honour. The bog body discoveries across Scandinavia and Northern Europe provide archaeological confirmation of this practice. Dozens of preserved bodies show evidence consistent with execution: hands bound, signs of fatal injuries suggesting ritualised killing, positioning and context indicating deliberate burial rather than accidental death. Chemical analysis of stomach contents sometimes reveals final meals consumed before death. Forensic examination of trauma patterns shows systematic violence, blows to the head, strangulation marks, throat cutting, inflicted in controlled circumstances rather than combat chaos. Some bog bodies show evidence of multiple killing methods applied simultaneously, strangled and throat cut and drowned, possibly representing overkill to ensure death or ritual requirements for particularly serious offenders. The Tolland man, found in a Danish bog and dated to approximately 400 BCE, pre-Viking but demonstrating long cultural continuity, was hanged and then placed in the bog, showing the combination of methods. Grauballet man showed blunt force trauma and throat cutting before bog deposition. These weren't simple executions but ritualised killings with profound spiritual significance. The cliff-throwing execution served similar purposes. Criminals were taken to specific execution cliffs, places associated with boundary crossing between human world and chaos beyond, and hurled to their deaths. The falling death was shameful. The broken body prevented normal burial, and the location marked the criminal as cast out from human community into wilderness. Some sagas mentioned specific execution cliffs by name, suggesting these were traditional locations used repeatedly for this purpose. The law's specification of a weaponless execution reveals how thoroughly religion and law were intertwined in Norse society. Legal proceedings weren't secular affairs but spiritual events where the community enacted cosmic order. Proper execution method ensured not just physical death but spiritual destruction, preventing the executed person from returning as ghost or claiming afterlife honours they didn't deserve. The law existed because improper execution, killing criminals with weapons, could pollute the community spiritually and permit the executed to claim warrior status they hadn't earned through honourable combat. Chapter 19. The Shared. Night Watch Law. Our next rule addresses community security, the Shared Night Watch Law, which mandated rotating guard duty among all able-bodied free men in the community. Settlements were required to maintain watches during vulnerable periods, darkness, fog, times of known raiding activity. The watch schedule rotated among households, with penalties for failing to appear for assigned duty, or worse, sleeping while on watch. This seems like simple defence until you understand that watch duty during winter meant choosing who would freeze to death protecting everyone else. Picture a small coastal settlement in Norway, winter darkness lasting 20 hours per day. The community has organised night watches, 2 men stationed at elevated positions where they can see approaches from sea or land, equipped with horns to sound alarm if threats appear. Tonight is your household's turn for watch duty. You and a neighbour climb to the watchpost in late afternoon, wrapped in every layer you own, carrying minimal supplies because you'll be exposed to wind and cold for the next 10 hours until dawn relief arrives. The watchpost itself offers little protection, perhaps a small windbreak, maybe a shelter just large enough to crouch inside, but mostly you're exposed because you need visibility to detect threats. Temperature is -15 Celsius with wind making it feel far colder. You can't build a large fire because it would ruin your night vision and reveal your position to potential raiders. You stamp your feet, swing your arms, fight against the desperate desire to sleep because sleeping in these conditions means freezing to death before dawn. The shared watch law existed because without organised watches, raiders could kill sleeping households without warning. Viking Age Scandinavia wasn't peaceful. Raiding between communities was common, opportunistic violence constant, and undefended settlements were easy targets. A successful raid could wipe out a household in minutes, kill the men, capture women and children as thralls, steal livestock and portable wealth. The night watch was the only defence mechanism, giving communities warning to arm themselves and mount resistance. But here's what made this truly brutal. Watch duty during winter meant freezing deaths among guards, and the system traded individual deaths for community survival. Guards died from exposure with depressing regularity. The cold was simply too intense for human survival during extended stationary periods. You could move constantly, generate body heat through activity, but vigilance required stillness and attention that precluded enough movement to stay warm. The watch law acknowledged this risk and mandated duty rotation anyway, because the alternative, no watch at all, meant everyone dying in raids rather than just the guards dying from cold. The archaeological evidence for watch posts is sparse because they were temporary structures, but defensive positioning around Norse settlements suggests organised security measures, excavations show communities built in defensible locations, elevated ground with good visibility, near water for escape routes, with clear sightlines to approaches. Some settlements show evidence of palisades or earthworks that would be useless without guards to man them. The investment in defensive infrastructure implies organised watches to make that infrastructure functional. The saga literature treats watch duty as grim but necessary obligation. Characters assigned to watch duty face the night with resignation, understanding the danger but accepting the necessity. Sagas describe guards dying from exposure, guards failing to stay alert and allowing raiders through, guards sounding alarms that save their communities despite their own deaths. The pattern is consistent. Watch duty was dangerous, often fatal, but communities couldn't survive without it. The penalties for watch duty violations were severe, precisely because one person's failure endangered everyone. Falling asleep on watch could result in heavy fines, temporary outlawry, or corporal punishment. Refusing assigned watch duty was treated as community betrayal, meriting serious legal consequences. The harshness reflected the stakes. Your failure to watch could mean 20 people murdered in their sleep, children enslaved, livestock stolen, the entire community destroyed or irreparably damaged. The system created horrible moral calculations. Families with elderly or sick members still had to fulfill watch obligations, often sending vulnerable people to guard duty, knowing they might not survive the exposure. Young men, most capable of enduring the cold, were assigned most watches, but that meant the most vital community members, those who could father children, perform heavy labour, defend in combat, were the ones most likely to die from exposure or violence during watch duty. Every assignment was potentially a death sentence. So the next time you read about Viking Age settlements and communities, remember the reality. Mandatory night watches where guards froze to death protecting sleeping families, winter darkness lasting 20 hours requiring constant vigilance, and watch laws existing because raiders timed attacks for maximum vulnerability, making organised watches the only defence, even though that defence meant systematic sacrifice of guards who died from exposure or violence so everyone else could sleep secure for one more night. Chapter 20. The Wet Nurse Contract Requirements. Our final rule in this fourth group takes us into the most intimate and tragic aspects of Norse life. The Wet Nurse Contract Requirements, which established legal obligations for fostering and milk sharing arrangements. When mothers died in childbirth or couldn't produce milk, when wealthy families wanted to outsource infant care, when orphaned infants needed nursing, formal contracts established terms for wet nurses, women who would breastfeed others, children for payment or social obligation. These contracts specified payment schedules, care standards, and crucially, compensation terms based on infant survival. This seems like childcare arrangement until you understand that contracts specified payment only for surviving children, acknowledging infant death as likely outcome rather than tragedy. Picture a farm in spring, a woman recovering from a difficult childbirth that damaged her ability to nurse. Her infant daughter needs milk or she'll starve within days. The family arranges a wet nurse contract with a woman from a neighbouring farm who recently gave birth and has milk to spare. The contract is formal, witnessed at the Thing assembly. The wet nurse will feed the infant for 1 year, receiving payment of 2 marks of silver if the child survives to weaning, 1 mark if the child survives 6 months, nothing if the child dies before 6 months. This payment structure isn't callousness, but realistic acknowledgement of infant mortality rates that killed nearly half of all children before age 5. The wet nurse herself faces grim calculations. Nursing another's child means less milk for her own infant, increased nutritional demands on her body, health risks from shared diseases. If both infants sicken, she must choose which to prioritise, the contract obligation or her biological child. If food becomes scarce, she must allocate inadequate nutrition between two infants, knowing both might die if she tries to feed both equally. The contract payment compensates for these risks and burdens, but only if the contracted child survives, creating perverse incentive to prioritise the paying family's child over her own. The law established these contracts partly to regulate fostering practices that were central to Norse social structure. Children were frequently fostered, sent to live with other families for years, creating social bonds and alliances. Wet nursing was the earliest form of fostering, beginning literally at birth. But unregulated wet nursing led to disputes. Families claimed their children died from neglect. Wet nurses claimed children died from natural illness. Arguments over payment erupted when outcomes were ambiguous. The contract requirements attempted to prevent these disputes by establishing clear terms agreed upon by witnesses. But here's what made this truly brutal. High infant mortality meant wet nurse contracts, specified payment only for surviving children, and dead babies meant unpaid labour. The contracts acknowledged child death as expected outcome. A wet nurse might nurse an infant for 6 months, investing enormous physical resources, only to receive no payment when the child died from disease or malnutrition that had nothing to do with her care quality. The economic risk fell entirely on the wet nurse, who provided service up front with payment contingent on survival she couldn't fully control. The skeletal evidence paints a grim picture of infant mortality. Excavated. Cemeteries show infant and child burials constituting 40 to 50% of all interments. Chemical analysis of infant bones reveals nutritional stress, disease markers, growth disruptions indicating chronic malnutrition. Many infants died from preventable causes by modern standards, infections, diarrheal disease, respiratory illness, but were essentially unsalvageable given Norse medical limitations. Wet nurses lost contracted children regularly, and each death meant months of unpaid labour and resource investment with no compensation. The saga literature treats fostering relationships as socially important, but rarely discusses the wet nurse contracts that initiated many fosterings. When mentioned, the focus is on surviving children who went on to become important figures, not the countless infants who died during nursing. This silence about infant mortality wasn't unusual. Cultures dealing with high child death rates often normalised it through silence rather than extensive mourning. The dead babies were too common to merit narrative attention. The system created moral hazards. Wet nurses had incentive to prioritise healthier-appearing infants who seemed likely to survive and earn payment. Weak or sickly contracted infants might receive less care than robust ones, because the wet nurse was calculating survival odds and allocating effort accordingly. This wasn't necessarily conscious cruelty but practical economics. Why invest fully in an infant who probably won't survive and earn payment when you have your own child needing care and limited resources to split between them? The contracts sometimes included provisions about what happened if the wet nurse's own infant died, freeing more milk for the contracted child. These clauses treated infant death as probable event requiring contractual address, rather than tragedy to be avoided mentioning. The cold legal language about if the wet nurse's child should die before the contracted child demonstrates how thoroughly infant mortality was integrated into economic and social planning. It's hard not to feel the weight of this system. Every wet nurse contract represented families desperate to keep infants alive in a world that killed children with horrifying efficiency. Every payment term acknowledged that success meant survival, not merely service provision. Every contract that ended with dead infant and no payment represented months of a woman's body supporting a child who died anyway, unpaid labour in service of unsuccessful outcome. The wet nurse contract requirements existed because infant mortality was so high that economic arrangements had to account for likely child death, and the law existed to prevent disputes over unpaid service when infants died, as everyone expected they probably would. Chapter 21. The Storm Shelter Access Law. Let us now turn to one of the most desperate regulations in Norse law, the Storm Shelter Access Law, which granted emergency entry rights during severe weather events. When storms reached life-threatening intensity, blizzards with zero visibility, winds that could knock people down, temperatures that killed exposed humans within hours, travellers were legally permitted to force entry into any dwelling for shelter, even against the owner's wishes. Property damage caused during such emergency entry was legally protected, and homeowners who resisted could face serious penalties. This seems like humanitarian necessity until you understand that the law existed because homeowners killed storm refugees trying to enter uninvited, leaving people to freeze to death on doorsteps of occupied homes. Picture a winter blizzard in Iceland, wind howling at 80 kilometers per hour, snow falling so thick you cannot see your own feet, temperature plunging to minus 25 Celsius. A traveller, caught between settlements when the storm hit, struggles toward a farmhouse he knows lies somewhere ahead. He's already been walking for hours, face numb with frostbite, fingers losing sensation, core temperature dropping dangerously. He finds the longhouse finally, smoke from the hearth barely visible through the driving snow. He pounds on the door, begging entry, shouting that he'll die outside. Inside, the homeowner faces a decision. This stranger could be anyone. A fugitive, an outlaw, someone carrying disease, a raider using the storm as cover. Opening the door means heat loss, means bringing in snow and wind that will chill everyone inside, means taking responsibility for a stranger's survival. The easiest choice is to do nothing, to pretend not to hear, to let the storm decide the stranger's fate. The homeowner stays silent. The door remains closed, and by morning the traveller's frozen corpse lies buried in snowdrift against the wall. The storm shelter law made this refusal illegal. During weather severe enough to kill, entry rights superseded property rights. A traveller could break down doors, shatter windows, force entry by any means necessary to survive. The property damage was legally protected as survival necessity. The homeowner who resisted faced charges of negligent homicide or even murder if the excluded person died. The law explicitly prioritised human survival over property protection during weather extremes. But here's what made this truly brutal. The law existed precisely because people froze to death on doorsteps of occupied homes while homeowners refused entry. This wasn't rare anomaly, but common enough to require legal prohibition. The cases that came before Thing assemblies demonstrated the pattern. Families found frozen outside longhouses, evidence showing they'd sought entry. Homeowners claiming they didn't hear or thought the noise was wind or feared opening doors during storms. The excuses varied, but the outcome was consistent. Dead travellers, occupied homes, and legal questions about whether the homeowners bore responsibility. The saga literature preserves storm shelter conflicts with disturbing regularity. Characters debate whether to admit storm refugees, weighing survival compassion against security fears. Some sagas treat homeowners who refuse shelter as villainous, others present it as understandable caution. The moral ambiguity reflects real conflicts between self-preservation and community obligation. In a world where strangers genuinely might be dangerous outlaws, where opening doors in blizzards could let in killing wind, where resources were already stretched thin, the obligation to shelter storm refugees was burdensome and potentially deadly to the household itself. The archaeological evidence for storm deaths is indirect but suggestive. Excavations near known travel routes sometimes reveal burials of single individuals in unusual locations, too far from settlements to be local, positions suggesting they died while travelling. Forensic analysis showing cold exposure deaths during winter months may represent storm casualties. The actual toll was certainly higher because many storm deaths left no recoverable remains, bodies buried under snow, consumed by animals before discovery, or simply never found in remote locations. The law also specified what constituted weather severe enough to trigger emergency entry rights. Not every storm qualified, only conditions that posed immediate lethal threat. The Assembly would hear testimony about storm severity, visibility conditions, temperature estimates, wind strength. This legal hair-splitting seems absurd until you understand it prevented abuse. Travellers couldn't claim storm entry rights during merely unpleasant weather, only during truly life-threatening conditions. The threshold had to be defined, or homeowners would be forced to admit anyone who claimed hardship. The enforcement mechanism was problematic. If a traveller died from exposure after being refused entry, their death might be investigated if they were important enough, or if their family brought charges. But many storm deaths involved people with no advocates: thralls, poor travellers, outlaws, foreigners. These deaths went uninvestigated, even when suspicious. The storm shelter law protected some people but couldn't protect everyone, and enforcement depended on the victim having social standing worth legal proceedings. It's hard not to see the desperation on both sides. Travellers caught in lethal storms genuinely would die without shelter, and their pleas for entry were literally begging for life. Homeowners genuinely faced risks from admitting strangers, and their refusal came from fear rather than pure cruelty. The storm shelter law tried to resolve this conflict by mandating compassion, making survival obligation trump security concerns, but it couldn't eliminate the underlying tension. The law existed because weather extremes created impossible choices, and without legal mandate, homeowners chose self-preservation over stranger survival, leaving people to freeze to death mere meters from life-saving warmth. Chapter 22: The Grain Storage Inspection. Our next rule addresses food security surveillance, the grain storage inspection, which mandated community audits of family food reserves during late winter and early spring. Local officials or community representatives were legally authorised to inspect grain stores, examine food preservation quality, and assess whether families had adequate supplies to reach the next harvest. Families found with excessive hoarding could be required to share or sell surplus. Families with insufficient stores might receive community assistance or, in extreme cases, face relocation requirements. This seems like social welfare until you understand that public inspections existed, because families hid food while neighbours starved, creating spring violence. Picture a Norse farm in late March, 5 months into winter, with perhaps 2 months remaining until spring planting yields any food. The official grain inspectors arrive, respected community members charged with assessing food situations across multiple households. They enter your storage areas, count remaining grain sacks, inspect preserved meat quality, assess hay supplies for livestock. They make notes, comparing your reserves against family size and expected needs. If you have surplus while neighbours face starvation, you'll be pressured to share or face social consequences. The inspection system emerged from brutal experience with winter food distribution. In unregulated conditions, some families hoarded resources while others starved. The hoarding wasn't necessarily malicious. Maybe they'd harvested well, and others hadn't. Maybe they'd been frugal while neighbours wasted food. Maybe they simply had fewer mouths to feed. But the disparity created violence. Starving families didn't quietly accept death while watching neighbours eat adequately. They stole, they raided storage areas, they killed hoarders and took food by force. The community inspection attempted to prevent this violence through forced transparency. Everyone's food situation became public knowledge. Families with surplus faced social pressure to share, backed by legal authority if pressure proved insufficient. Families approaching starvation received intervention, perhaps food sharing from surplus households, perhaps community loans to be repaid after harvest, perhaps extreme measures like foster placement of children to reduce household food demands. The goal was preventing starvation deaths that would trigger blood feuds and social collapse. But here's what made this truly brutal. Forced transparency prevented murder over hoarded grain but shamed struggling families publicly. The inspection revealed not just food quantities, but family management competence. A household with inadequate stores was publicly marked as having failed to harvest sufficiently, failed to preserve properly, failed to manage consumption through winter. This shame had real social consequences. Your standing in the community dropped. Your children's marriage prospects dimmed. Your voice in assembly proceedings carried less weight. The inspection that prevented starvation also created permanent reputation damage. The archaeological evidence for grain storage is extensive. Excavated farms show storage pit complexes, underground chambers lined with stone or timber, sometimes holding thousands of litres of grain. The sophistication of these storage systems demonstrates how critical grain preservation was to survival. Chemical analysis of storage pit residues shows evidence of various grains, barley, oats, rye, and reveals preservation techniques using smoke, salt, and careful moisture management. The investment in storage infrastructure was enormous, indicating that successful communities had complex systems for managing this vital resource. But the storage pits also show evidence of catastrophic failures. Some pits show fire damage, possibly from deliberate destruction during conflicts. Others show moisture infiltration that ruined stored grain. Some appear to have been deliberately emptied and refilled multiple times during single winters, suggesting redistribution activities consistent with community-managed sharing. The physical evidence supports the literary accounts of community food management as organised, systematic response to scarcity rather than individual family autonomy. The saga literature treats grain inspections as normal, unremarkable aspects of winter survival. Characters mention inspections in passing, discuss community food redistribution decisions, describe conflicts over hoarding accusations. The ordinariness of these references demonstrates how thoroughly integrated such practices were. This wasn't emergency response for unusual crises, but routine winter practice, acknowledgement that food scarcity was normal condition requiring active community management every single year. The inspection system created perverse incentives. Families might understate their reserves to avoid sharing obligations, hiding food in undisclosed locations or lying about quantities. Inspectors developed counter-strategies, surprise inspections, independent counting methods, penalties for discovered deception. The dynamic resembled surveillance resistance cycles, with both sides knowing the stakes were literal survival. Successfully hiding food meant your family eating while others starved. Successfully detecting hidden food meant community survival, but individual family resentment. It's hard not to recognise the impossible position this law addressed. Food scarcity made hoarding rational individual strategy. Keep maximum food to maximise your family's survival odds. But collective hoarding while others starved created violence that endangered everyone. The inspection law forced cooperation through mandatory transparency, sacrificing privacy and autonomy for collective survival. The law existed because unchecked individual food management led to some families feasting while others starved to death, and that disparity triggered murders and raids that killed more people than starvation would have, making forced inspection and redistribution the lesser evil in a world with no good options. Chapter 23. The Ice Fishing Territory. Law. Let us now examine one of the most dangerous resource conflicts, the Ice Fishing Territory Law, which attempted to regulate winter fishing ground allocation. When fjords, lakes, and rivers froze solid, ice fishing became a critical protein source during months when other food acquisition was impossible. The law specified territory divisions, hole spacing requirements, safety protocols for ice thickness, and dispute resolution procedures. Violating territorial boundaries or safety rules could result in fines, equipment confiscation, or violence from competing fishermen. This seems like winter resource management until you understand that ice fishing disputes ended with people pushed through ice holes to drown. Picture a frozen fjord in January. ice thick enough to support human weight, but thin enough in places to be dangerous. Multiple families have traditional fishing territories marked by stakes or stones, invisible boundaries everyone knows but strangers might miss. You drill your ice hole, drop your line, wait in brutal cold for fish to bite. Your neighbour's hole is perhaps 20 metres away, close enough to see, far enough to maintain territorial separation. Then a stranger appears, an outsider from another valley, drilling holes in territory everyone local considers yours. The territorial violation is obvious, the legal remedy unclear, the physical confrontation almost inevitable. The ice fishing territory law emerged from accumulated violence over winter fishing rights. The territories were based on tradition, kinship claims, historical precedent. Nothing written, nothing officially registered, just community understanding of who fished where. This worked fine within stable communities where everyone knew the boundaries. It collapsed when outsiders appeared, when family lines died out leaving territorial claims disputed, when desperation drove people to fish anywhere they could reach regardless of traditional boundaries. The hole spacing requirement served both safety and resource management. Drilling holes too close together could weaken ice, creating catastrophic failures where entire sections collapsed, drowning everyone in that area. Too many holes in concentrated areas also depleted local fish populations, making all holes less productive. The law mandated minimum spacing, typically 10 to 15 metres between holes, to manage both risks. But enforcement was nearly impossible on vast frozen expanses where no authority could monitor every fisher. But here's what made this truly brutal. Territorial disputes ended with people pushed through ice holes to drown, and laws couldn't prevent murders when starvation drove desperation. The murder method was opportunistic and difficult to prosecute. A man fishing alone through his ice hole, attention focused downward on his line, was vulnerable to attack from behind. A strong shove sent him through his own hole into water so cold it stopped your heart within minutes. Even if you surfaced, the ice around the hole prevented escape. You couldn't pull yourself out, couldn't find another opening, drowned or froze within 5 minutes, while your murderer retrieved your fishing gear and left no witnesses. The archaeological evidence for ice fishing is indirect. Specialised equipment, ice augers, weighted lines, hooks, appears in excavations of Norse sites. The sophistication of this equipment demonstrates ice fishing was systematic practice, not occasional activity, but evidence of the violence is harder to find. Bodies that went through ice in winter often weren't recovered until spring thaw, if ever. Rivers and fjords carried bodies away. Scavengers consumed remains. The actual death toll from ice fishing murders was likely substantial, but largely invisible to archaeology. The saga literature preserves multiple drowning accounts during winter fishing disputes. Characters argue over fishing rights. Violence erupts. Someone goes through the ice, accidentally. The saga authors sometimes treat these as murders, sometimes as accidents, but the pattern is consistent. Ice fishing created killing opportunities that desperate or vengeful people exploited. The frozen water was weapon and disposal system simultaneously, making murder relatively easy and detection nearly impossible. The territory law attempted to prevent these conflicts through recognised boundaries and dispute resolution procedures. If territories were contested, the Thing Assembly could hear evidence and render judgment. Historical fishing patterns, kinship claims, prior agreements, all could be presented and evaluated. But assembly judgments rendered in summer had little force in winter, when the nearest legal authority was days away, and the disputed fishing holes were contested daily by armed men operating in isolation. The law also addressed what happened when someone drowned through their ice hole. Investigation procedures, liability determinations, compensation requirements. If witnesses existed and testified that someone pushed the victim, murder charges could be brought. But ice fishing typically happened in isolation or small groups, and witnesses to territorial murders were rare. Most drownings were ruled accidents, even when suspicious, because proving murder without witnesses was impossible. it's hard not to see the desperation that made ice fishing so contested. Winter eliminated most food acquisition methods. Hunting was difficult in deep snow. Livestock were precious breeding stock that couldn't be slaughtered. Stored food dwindled through long months. Ice fishing provided protein when nothing else was available, making those frozen fishing holes literally survival resources. The conflicts weren't really about abstract property rights, but about whether your children would have protein for another week. The ice fishing territory law existed because that desperation made people kill each other over fishing holes, drowning competitors to secure exclusive access to resources, and the law couldn't prevent those murders because enforcement was impossible, and survival made violence rational choice. Chapter 24. The Childbirth Witness Requirement. Our next rule takes us into the most intimate and tragic aspect of Norse life, the childbirth witness requirement, which mandated presence of multiple witnesses at all births. When a woman went into labour, at least 2 witnesses beyond the midwife, typically female relatives or neighbours, were legally required to be present throughout delivery and immediate postpartum period. These witnesses served multiple purposes: establishing paternity for inheritance, verifying live birth versus stillbirth, documenting any complications, and critically, ensuring infant survival was legitimate rather than infanticide. This seems like support system until you understand that witnesses verified live births versus stillbirths because desperate mothers suffocated struggling infants they couldn't feed. Picture a longhouse during difficult childbirth, late winter, when food supplies run desperately low. The mother has laboured for hours, finally delivering an infant that emerges alive but weak, small, possibly premature, crying feebly. The family already has 3 living children. Food stores will barely support them until harvest. Adding another mouth to feed might doom everyone to starvation. The mother looks at her newborn and sees not a child but a death sentence for her other children. Without witnesses, she might press the infant's face into bedding until the crying stops, claim it was stillborn, dispose of the body as one of countless infants who died during or shortly after birth. With witnesses present, that choice is eliminated. The witness requirement emerged from widespread infanticide practice that threatened community survival in different ways. Infanticide of healthy infants represented lost future labour, lost potential warriors or childbearers, lost community members in a world where population was genuine constraint. But more immediately, it represented uncontrolled family planning that disrupted inheritance patterns, created disputed paternity claims, and allowed women autonomous reproductive decisions that patriarchal society couldn't tolerate. The witnesses documented everything, whether the infant emerged alive or dead, whether it breathed and cried or was silent, whether any complications occurred, what the mother said during and after delivery. This testimony would be crucial if paternity was ever questioned, if inheritance disputes arose, if someone claimed the child that survived wasn't the one actually born. The witnesses created legal record, enforceable at future thing assemblies, that established the child's legitimacy and right to inherit. But here's what made this truly brutal. Witnesses prevented infanticide claims, but not actual infanticide. Determined mothers could still kill newborns, they just had to do it less obviously. A pillow pressed over a weak infant's face for 30 seconds during a moment when witnesses looked away. Neglecting to clear mucus from airways during delivery. Accidentally dropping the newborn in ways that caused fatal head trauma. Exposing the infant to cold during the immediate postpartum period when witnesses had left. The witness requirement made obvious infanticide prosecutable, but couldn't prevent subtle neglect or disguised killing. The skeletal evidence is heartbreaking. Excavations of Norse settlements show infant burial rates suggesting 40 to 50% mortality before age 5, but neonatal deaths were even higher. Perhaps half of all infants died within days of birth. Some of these deaths were natural, complications from difficult births, genuine stillbirths, genetic defects incompatible with survival. but statistical analysis suggests excess neonatal mortality consistent with selective neglect or infanticide, particularly female infants during periods of resource stress. The bones can't tell us whether deaths were natural or induced, but the patterns suggest human choice was sometimes involved. The saga literature rarely discusses infanticide directly, but references appear in legal contexts and moral arguments. The practice of exposure, leaving unwanted infants outside to die from cold or predation, is mentioned matter-of-factly in some texts, treated as legitimate parental decision under certain circumstances. The witness requirement didn't prohibit this practice, but required it to be done openly, with community knowledge, rather than disguised as natural death. The distinction seems meaningless to modern ethics, but was apparently important legally. Acknowledged exposure was different from secret murder. The childbirth witness requirement also served paternity establishment for inheritance purposes. In a culture with concubinage, frequent travel, unclear marriage boundaries, paternity could be genuinely ambiguous. The witnesses testified about timing of birth relative to conception, physical resemblance to the presumed father, the mother's statements about paternity. This testimony would be crucial when the child reached adulthood and claimed inheritance. The witnesses from birth could be called to assembly proceedings decades later to testify about legitimacy. The requirement created additional burden on women during most vulnerable time. Childbirth was already dangerous, painful, often fatal. Adding mandatory witness presence meant no privacy, no autonomy over the experience, constant surveillance during intimate medical process. Women couldn't control who witnessed their births, couldn't exclude people they disliked, couldn't manage their own deliveries according to their preferences. The witness requirement prioritised legal documentation over maternal well-being, treating childbirth as primarily legal event rather than medical or personal experience. It's hard not to feel the weight of this system. Every birth happened under legal surveillance designed to prevent maternal autonomy over infant survival. Every witness was potential testimony in future legal proceedings about the child's legitimacy or survival circumstances. Every newborn was documented property with legal rights that superseded maternal decision-making. The childbirth witness requirement existed because infant mortality and infanticide were so common that establishing legal record of birth circumstances was considered more important than privacy or maternal autonomy. And the law existed to prevent mothers from killing infants they couldn't feed. Even though the law couldn't actually prevent those deaths, only make them harder to disguise as natural mortality. Chapter 25. The Spring Assembly Attendance. Our final rule brings us full circle to the thing assembly itself, the Spring Assembly Attendance Law, which mandated compulsory participation for all free men in the community. Missing the spring assembly without legitimate excuse, illness, severe weather, disaster at home, could result in fines, loss of legal standing, or social ostracism. The law recognised some exceptions, but treated assembly participation as fundamental civic obligation, not optional activity. This seems like democratic engagement until you understand that mandatory attendance meant vulnerable farms left unguarded, and raiders timed attacks during assemblies when men were away. Picture the Spring Thing Assembly in Norway, mid-May, when weather finally permits travel and outdoor gathering. Free men from dozens of farms gather at the traditional assembly ground, leaving their households to travel for days. The assembly lasts perhaps a week, time for legal cases to be heard, disputes resolved, judgments rendered, social bonds renewed. It's essential gathering for maintaining legal order and community cohesion. But every farm in the region now has reduced security. The adult men who would defend against threats are absent, leaving women, children, elderly, and thralls to manage everything. The mandatory attendance law served multiple purposes. The assembly required quorum to function. You couldn't adjudicate cases fairly without adequate witness and community representation. Social bonds that held scattered communities together required face-to-face renewal. Legal judgments needed public witness to carry authority. Men who skipped assemblies undermined the entire legal system, free-riding on others' participation while avoiding their own obligations. The law forced participation to prevent defection that would collapse the system. The exceptions to mandatory attendance reveal what the law considered legitimate excuses: serious illness that prevented travel, family emergencies like childbirth complications, natural disasters affecting your farm, caring for dying relatives. These might excuse absence if you sent representative or explanation, but mere inconvenience, dislike of travel, pressing farm work, economic hardship, none of these excused absence. The law assumed assembly participation was so important that almost nothing justified skipping it. But here's what made this truly brutal. Mandatory attendance meant vulnerable farms left unguarded, and raiders timed attacks during assemblies when men were away. The assembly schedule was public knowledge. Everyone knew when the thing would occur. This made it perfect opportunity for opportunistic raiders. A farm with only women and thralls present was easy target. Livestock could be stolen, food stores raided, buildings damaged, with minimal resistance. The raiders would be gone before assembly men returned, and pursuing them meant missing the assembly entirely, facing penalties for absence. The saga literature preserves this pattern repeatedly. Raiders, sometimes from distant regions, sometimes from rival communities within the same area, specifically targeted assembly periods for attacks. Characters discuss the dilemma: attend the assembly and leave your farm vulnerable, or protect your property and face legal consequences for absence. The forced choice between civic duty and property protection created no-win situations where either option carried serious risks. The law attempted to address this through collective security arrangements. Neighbouring farms that didn't have men at assembly might coordinate watches. Some men would attend assembly while others stayed back, rotating annually. Communities near assembly grounds might host men's families during assembly, providing some protection through concentration. But none of these solutions were perfect, and all required trust and coordination that sometimes failed. The assembly attendance requirement also revealed class dynamics within free society. Wealthy farmers could send representatives, sons, relatives, trusted thralls with authority to speak, while they remained home protecting property. Poor free men lacked such options and had to attend personally or face penalties. The law was theoretically egalitarian, all free men must attend, but practical application favoured wealthy who could delegate, while poor had to choose between legal and property security. The penalties for unexcused absence were designed to hurt. Loss of legal standing meant you couldn't bring cases to future assemblies, couldn't vote on community decisions, couldn't serve as witness in legal proceedings. For a free man, loss of legal standing was catastrophic. It meant you had no recourse against injustice, no voice in community affairs, no protection except what you could enforce personally. The threat of this penalty compelled attendance even when it meant genuine hardship and danger. It's hard not to see the impossible position this law created. The assembly was genuinely essential for maintaining legal order. Without it, disputes turned into blood feuds, communities fragmented, social cohesion collapsed. But mandatory attendance created systematic vulnerability that enemies exploited. The law existed because legal system required participation, and participation couldn't be voluntary because too many would defect. But mandatory participation meant raiders could attack undefended farms with impunity during assembly periods, making the gathering that was supposed to maintain order into the vulnerability that threatened it. And so, we come to the end of our examination of these bizarre Viking rules, though perhaps bizarre is no longer the word that comes to mind. What seemed strange at the beginning, mandatory hospitality, weaponless executions, grain inspections, ice fishing territories, now reveals itself as desperate pragmatism in the face of environment that killed without mercy and society that could collapse into violence at any moment. These weren't arbitrary traditions passed down from some heroic age, but hard-won survival strategies developed through generations of trial and catastrophic error. Consider what we've learned tonight. Every rule we examined existed because its absence led to disaster. The hospitality law existed because travellers froze on doorsteps of occupied homes. The ale requirement existed because contaminated water killed children. The weapon peace existed because assemblies became massacre sites. The outlawry sentence existed because blood feuds depopulated regions. The bathing law existed because parasitic infections turned gangrenous. On and on, 25 examples of the same pattern. Identify what kills people, create rule to prevent it, enforce through legal sanction because voluntary compliance fails. But there's something else here too, something darker that we need to acknowledge. These rules reveal how thin the margin between survival and death actually was in Viking Age Scandinavia. We're not talking about hardship or discomfort or reduced quality of life. We're talking about constant proximity to death from cold, starvation, disease, violence, and accident. One stolen cartload of firewood could mean a family freezing. One failed harvest could mean community starvation. One inheritance dispute could trigger feuds that killed dozens. The rules existed because the margin was that thin, because one misstep meant death not just for you, but for everyone who depended on you. It makes you reconsider everything you thought you knew about Viking culture, doesn't it? The sagas, the television shows, the romantic notions of warriors and explorers, all of that sits atop this foundation of desperate survival in impossible conditions. Yes, Vikings raided and explored and built trade networks across continents, but they did all that while also managing the daily reality of ice fishing murders, grain storage, inspections, sick house abandonments and mandatory assembly attendance that left farms vulnerable to raids. The adventure and glory were real, but so was the grinding hardship that made basic survival a daily achievement rather than assumed baseline. Perhaps most striking is how thoroughly these rules integrated violence into legal and social order. Dueling grounds with shield replacement rules, outlawry as slow-motion execution, weaponless executions for spiritual pollution, ice fishing territories contested through drowning murders, inheritance announcements followed by ambush killings. The Norse legal system didn't prevent violence, it channeled it, regulated it, tried to contain it within manageable bounds. The implicit acceptance was that people would kill each other. The goal was preventing every killing from triggering cascading feuds that destroyed communities entirely. And yet, for all the darkness we've examined tonight, there's something almost admirable in the sheer stubborn persistence of Norse communities. They lived in places that should have been uninhabitable. Fjords, where winter darkness lasted months. Islands where forests disappeared within centuries. Mountains where growing seasons lasted weeks. They did this without modern medicine, without sanitation, without heating systems beyond open fires, without food preservation beyond salting and drying. The infant mortality, the winter deaths, the violence, the disease, all of it was just the price of surviving in that place, and they paid it generation after generation. Of course, we should be careful about romanticising even this persistence. The survival came at horrific cost. Not just the death tolls we've discussed, but the systematic cruelty that survival required. Thralls killed when injured beyond work capacity, children abandoned in sick houses, livestock slaughtered wholesale every autumn, desperate mothers smothering infants they couldn't feed. These weren't aberrations or failures of the system. They were the system functioning as designed, making hard choices that kept communities functioning at terrible price to the vulnerable. It's worth reflecting, as we approach the end of our time together tonight, on what separates their world from ours. We live in unprecedented comfort and safety, insulated from the natural world by layers of technology and infrastructure they couldn't imagine. Clean water from taps, heat at the turn of a dial, food from grocery stores, medicine for infections, legal systems backed by organised police forces. The baseline security we take for granted was literally unimaginable to the Norse people we've been discussing. Their bizarre rules reveal what human society looks like when that security doesn't exist, when survival is genuine daily question rather than assumed baseline. And maybe that's the real lesson here, if we're looking for lessons. The Norse weren't fundamentally different people than we are. They weren't more violent or cruel or pragmatic by nature. They were humans responding to conditions that demanded the behaviours we've examined. Given similar circumstances, would we do differently? When the choice is between letting your children starve or stealing your neighbour's grain, between freezing or forcing entry to someone's home, between abandoning sick family members or risking everyone to disease, what choices would we actually make? The Norse rules reveal uncomfortable truths about what humans become when survival margins are thin enough. But I can see I'm getting philosophical, and it's late, and you've been extraordinarily patient through 25 chapters of grim historical reality. So let me offer my gratitude, dear listener, for accompanying me through this difficult material. These aren't easy subjects. Systematic abandonment, casual violence, normalised child death, desperate resource conflicts. It takes something to sit with these realities for hours, to really understand not just what happened, but why it had to happen given the constraints these people faced. I hope, in some strange way, that these explorations make you appreciate the world we've inherited. Not because our ancestors were particularly wise or good, we've seen evidence of both wisdom and horror tonight, but because generations of humans struggled through impossible conditions to build systems that eventually led to the security we enjoy. The Thing assemblies, for all their violence and limitations, were attempts at legal order. The resource management rules, for all their harshness, tried to distribute scarcity fairly. The survival regulations, for all their cruelty, kept communities functioning when everything pushed toward collapse. So perhaps take a moment before you sleep tonight to appreciate clean water and central heating and modern medicine and legal systems backed by organised authority. Appreciate that you don't need mandatory bathing laws because sanitation is infrastructure. Don't need grain inspections because food security isn't constant crisis. Don't need travel companion laws because solo travellers aren't routine murder victims. All the things that made Viking rules necessary, those desperate circumstances, have been overcome through centuries of technological and social progress. The rules reveal what we've escaped. And speaking of sleep, I can sense we're reaching that gentle transition point where educational content meets rest. Your breathing has perhaps slowed, your thoughts have started to drift, the weight of your eyelids has increased. This is exactly as it should be. We've journeyed through 25 chapters of historical reality, examined laws and regulations that reveal a world almost incomprehensible from our modern perspective. And now it's time to let all that knowledge settle into your mind like snow accumulating on a Norse farmstead. Quiet and gradual and peaceful. Picture, if you will, the Thing assembly one final time. Not the violence or the legal proceedings, but the aftermath. The assembly ends, judgments rendered, men beginning their journeys home. The sun, because it's summer and the sun barely sets in those northern latitudes, hangs low on the horizon, painting everything golden. The assembly ground slowly empties, people packing up their temporary camps, saying farewells to relatives and friends they might not see for another year. There's exhaustion, but also relief. Another year's disputes resolved, another gathering completed without catastrophe, another set of laws confirmed or modified to meet new circumstances. One man remains behind after the others have left, standing on the law rock where proclamations were made. He's thinking about the cases he witnessed, the judgments rendered, the weight of maintaining order in a world that constantly pushes toward chaos. But as the light fades, as much as it fades in the endless summer twilight, his thoughts shift to his own farm, his family waiting for his return, the work that needs doing before autumn arrives. The legal proceedings recede into memory, important but not all-consuming. Life continues, as it always has, balancing survival necessity with moments of beauty and connection. Thank you for spending these hours with me, exploring boring history in its most literal sense, the unglamorous, uncomfortable, often disturbing details that rarely make it into popular accounts. If you found value in this exploration, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you might imagine, and it encourages me to continue these deep examinations of historical realities. Sleep well, dear listener, wherever in the world you find yourself. May your rest be peaceful, undisturbed by thoughts of ice fishing murders, or grain inspections, or sick house abandonments. And may you wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for the world we have inherited. A world where bizarre Viking rules are historical curiosities rather than daily necessities, where survival is baseline rather than achievement, where the desperate pragmatism of the past has been replaced by securities our ancestors couldn't begin to imagine. Good night.